Holy crap, how did I miss out on this show? So, I'm a VHS collector. Specifically, I collect VHS recordings of old TV broadcasts. As you can see here. Yeah, I've got a little bit of a problem. But anyways, my hunt for more deliciously rare collectibles has led me to stumble across this. It's a VHS recording of the world premiere of the series finale of Orel, Honor, which I may or may not talk about someday, but to tell you guys the truth, as much as I love great adult animated shows like Drawn Together, Futurama, South Park, The Simpsons, and whatever this is, I swear it's good, give it a shot. I have never once seen Orel. I've seen some pictures and some episode descriptions and maybe a clip or two here and there, but up until recently, and by recently I mean 6 hours ago, I didn't actually get into the show at all. It was because of that tape when I finally sat down to watch it and I realized I missed out. So, because I had the day off from work today, which is incredibly rare, I decided to catch up on the show and oh, wow. So, apparently the show got really serious really quickly. The show was supposed to last about 5 seasons, getting darker and more disturbing as it went on, but apparently, according to both Adult Swim and the series creator, the show became too dark for the lineup and was eventually cancelled. And it wasn't like, the show's getting a little too dark for us, so we're gonna have you finish up the season, wrap up the show, and we'll call it quits. No, it was more like, hey, yeah, by the way, the series is getting a little too serious for us now, so we're gonna cut your 3rd season and final season, by the way, in half. Bye-bye, see you later. That's how it went. I have never once heard of a show getting canned because it was too dark and depressing. So I did some research on that and, well, I figured out why. The show was taking a very sinister turn, especially in the nature two-parter, but that wasn't the episode that got the show canned, no. According to the series creator, the show got canned because of one special episode that he dubbed the final nail in the coffin for Orel. That being the episode, Alone. So, one of the weird things about this, which right off the bat tips you off to how different this is gonna be, is that Orel and the whole family really aren't in this. Orel appears very, very briefly only by a dialogue cameo, and that's about it. Instead, this episode decides to focus more on the side characters, and we're gonna go through them one by one. First off, Miss Censordoll is having a heated over-the-phone argument with her mother because apparently, when Miss Censordoll was an infant, her mother had her eggs removed, and if you don't know what that means, you're way, way too young to be watching this review, so get on going. We've got lots of other family-friendly reviews for you, just don't watch this one, okay? Okay, good. There's also some heavy implications that Miss Censordoll has this evil plan to take over the town, and we never really get to see this come to fruition. It's strongly implied, but that's about it. In Season 5, Miss Censordoll was supposed to have this big story arc where she takes over the town and rules it with an iron fist just like she always wanted. But of course, the show got cancelled before we got to see any of that, so sadly, we're basically left to imagine what it would be like, but hey, at least we got something, right? This story was definitely strange, but not really different from Orel. But that's where the other 2 stories come in. Nurse Bendy is basically the town harlot. Everyone idolizes her for her, features, let's just say, and she's been with basically every single man in town. But in this episode, we get to see a brand new side to her. It turns out that mentally, Nurse Bendy is basically a child. She has the vocabulary of a child, the mannerisms of a child, the worldview of a child, all that sort of stuff. Which makes things much, much worse when you realize her role in the town. Not the best. But it gets so much worse than that. It turns out that Nurse Bendy really wants a family. A group of people to be there for her and who will love her for who she truly is instead of the nasty, dirty things that she can provide. She does this by playing make-believe with 2 bears. One named Sunny, who's her son, and one named Hubby, who's, well, take a wild guess. This is her escape. This is all she has to get away from the outside world. Because as soon as she leaves the door of her apartment, everyone's out to get her for, again, dirty, nasty things. But then, everything goes horribly wrong when Hubby Bear falls on her in a very suggestive position. To Nurse Bendy, this means that Hubby Bear was only out to get her for sex, and she can't handle it. The one place that she could be happy, the one place she was guaranteed safety, is no longer viable. Everything's ruined. And that's the end of the story. She's just left there, alone, defenseless, no longer having a fantasy world to escape to. Yeah. That's fun. But if you thought that was bad, oh boy. Get a load of the other story here. Now, I'm gonna warn you, this is gonna be very severe. I don't even know if YouTube's gonna let us monetize this, but, you know, we're gonna have to take that risk because this needs to be discussed. Miss Scultham, Orel's teacher, has apparently just been raped by Cecil Creepler, the town's ice cream man. And she's going through a lot of struggles because she aborted the pregnancy and she's having guilty thoughts about actually wanting to meet up with him again and enjoying what she experienced. And she hears that Cecil Creepler died in jail, and the whole thing is triggering her even further. The beauty of this part is that there's no dialogue from our main character. All we really get is Reverend Putty having a couple lines and the newscaster. That's all. Everything is left to be analyzed entirely visually. And it is stunning. The artistry here is the best it's ever been, and you can't change my mind. So apparently, before Moral Orel was cancelled early, there was going to be an episode entitled, well, This, and it was basically going to kind of be a follow-up to this, or a little bit of a psychoanalyzing experience with Miss Scultham. I really would have liked to see that, but yeah, I can kind of see why Adult Swim didn't really go for this one. Still, would have been interesting. But this one really messed me up. When this one was done, I had to just stare out a window because I could not believe what I just saw. And I still can't. I still don't think I'm over it. I mean, it hasn't been too long since I saw it for the very first time, but still. Wow. This episode is dark. This episode is messed up. But I loved it, loved it, loved it. To be fair, it messed me up like crazy when I saw it because I was not expecting that at all. All I heard was the episode alone was the most distinct of the entire show. The person who told me that didn't say how it was distinct, so I'm gonna have to mail him a glitter bomb for that later. I had to process this for a few minutes. Wow. I love shows and episodes where they sit back and analyze the characters, especially ones that aren't in the main cast. Like this one. I also love the dark themes it presents and how it doesn't outright explain it to you. It's left for you to interpret. That's not to say it's open-ended, there's 100% clear, concise points they're trying to make. It's just up for you to figure them out. It's kind of like a mystery. Really, this episode has to be seen to be believed, but be warned, it's not for the weak of heart. Now, do I think that it was a good idea to cancel Moral Orel because it got too serious? No, of course not. The show was great. Let's be real. Adult Swim has a certain style of show. We all know the type. 12-ounce Mouse, Aqua Teen Hunger Force, Super Jail. Now, I do like some of these shows. Aqua Teen is fantastic, and Space Ghost, oh, don't even get me started. But it's always good to have a little bit of a break from the flow. A little bit of a standout show. That's one of the reasons why Invader Zim got so popular. It wasn't like all the others. It wasn't like SpongeBob, Jimmy Neutron, or the Wild Thornberries. It got popular because it dared to be different. Moral Orel was the exact same way. And hey, if the show was getting too extreme for Adult Swim, here's an idea. Tell the showrunners that. Tell them, hey, the episode alone was great, just don't make another one, please. Kinda go back to the sillier stuff. Maybe the showrunners didn't want to do that. Maybe they would have been open to it, who's to say? That's all conjecture at this point. But I'm gonna play devil's advocate for a second. Bear with me, everybody. So, if Adult Swim was looking at the way Moral Orel was going, you know, with the extra character development and darker themes being introduced, they were already probably strongly considering going back to the same old well that they've been to time and time again. And spoiler alert, keep going to time and time again, even now. But then they saw this and thought, okay, the show is never going to go back to what it used to be. It's probably only going to get worse. We got to get rid of it. Do I agree with that? No, but at least I can see where they're coming from, even if it was objectively wrong. I'm being biased though, so ignore that, please. Who am I kidding? It's the internet. You're not going to ignore that. This is how much the episode really spoke to me. I saw this episode today, did tons and tons of research on it, and bam, here we go! Of course, to be fair, we make these Media Mementos episodes months in advance, but you get what I'm trying to say, don't you? Holy crap, I need to watch the rest of the show. By the time this episode has come out, I've probably already finished the show, but at the time of recording, I've seen about 12 episodes, and they're pretty short, so I could get through them pretty quickly. But yes, the creator has confirmed it. This is it. This is the episode that was so dark, so twisted, so complex and intellectual, that it got Moral Orel cancelled. This is the reason we didn't get seasons 4 and 5. This is the reason we never got that arc of Miss Censordoll taking over the town. But even so, that doesn't take away from how brilliant and utterly disturbing Alone truly is. It comes as no surprise to people when I tell them this. I love Moral Orel. You know that video we made a little while ago about the episode that got Moral Orel cancelled? And how I mentioned that I am so upset that I missed out on the show in its prime? Well, now I'm gonna make up for it. Now I'm gonna start making a lot more Moral Orel videos. I'm hoping to make it a bit of a staple on the channel like The Proud Family or Jimmy Neutron. And in order to do that, we have to plan to make a lot of Moral Orel videos. We've got 4 others in the works right now, and we're not even done yet. But today, we're gonna start them all off, I guess, technically speaking, start them all off unless you don't count the other video, with a character quest. You know, the show where we take a look at underappreciated or underanalyzed characters and tell you what makes them work? Yep, Moral Orel is full of characters that could have these. Characters like Florence, Reverend Putty, Clay and Bloberta, who will actually get theirs in January, or the subject of today's character quest, or rather, subjects, Shapey and Block. Upon hearing this, I'm sure all of you Moral Orel fans out there are saying, "You're kidding me, right? Shapey and Block? What do they have to make them work?" Let me tell you the unfinished coming-of-age story of Shapey Puppington and Block Possibile. First of all, we have to start with Shapey Puppington because, given his last name Puppington, he's obviously connected with the main family. So, you know, Clay's the dad, Bloberta's the mom, Orel's the brother, and so now Shapey's the other brother, right? Yeah, well, that's true, but he doesn't quite fit in. Take a look at him next to Clay. Do they look anything alike? The answer is obviously no, because Shapey is, in fact, an illegitimate child. He is actually the product of an affair between Bloberta and Coach Danielle Stopframe. Stopframe only took part in this, though, to get closer to Clay. I don't necessarily know how that works, but oh well, it happened, and now Shapey has been brought into the world, and he is an unadulterated terror. This kid is a monster through and through. Even though he's 7, he barely speaks coherently, he screams in order to get his way, he throws temper tantrums, he gets angry at the drop of a dime. Basically every parent's worst nightmare. But how did he get this way? Well, first of all, Bloberta has been coddling him like crazy. She's still breastfeeding him even though he's 7 years old. So obviously he's being kept young. Not necessarily on purpose, we don't really know why. I kind of think it's just so that Bloberta can have a little bit more control over him because, let's face it, she has no control over anything else. And there's another reason for his behavior. For that, we have to look at Orel Puppington, his older brother. Older half-brother, but still, older brother nonetheless. Judging by before Orel, Orel never really acted like Shapey when he was younger. He was kind, he was sweet, and extremely gullible. Shapey is none of those things, except maybe gullible, but still, 2 out of 3 isn't bad. Well, it's clear that over the years, Clay and Bloberta have really checked out of their marriage. Although, Clay has never really been interested at all, so I'm sure that he was never an attentive parent to Orel, as has been confirmed in Before Orel once again. It's clear that Bloberta at least tried to make things work. All she ever wanted was that happy family and to be useful to someone. That someone would either be her husband or her child. But of course, with Shapey around now and Danielle Stopframe no longer talking to her, she realizes she's stuck in this unhappy, unlovable marriage with Clay, and now Shapey is the constant reminder of that, and so who cares? It's very possible that Shapey was gonna naturally have some behavior issues anyways, but it's clear that she doesn't care enough to make things better. Whenever he begs or complains, she gives him whatever he wants just so that he'll stay quiet. And Clay? You kidding me? He hates Shapey. He may not know who's the dad, or maybe he's in denial about it, but he knows for a fact that Shapey isn't his. So, he doesn't care. Not one bit. This causes Shapey to experience tons of neglect. Neither parent really cares about him, so he's constantly throwing himself into harm's way. Not on purpose, it's just because he's an unruly, undisciplined kid. Then halfway through the show, a new family moves in next door to the Puppingtons, and they are basically the exact same as them, only slightly altered. They even have an unruly, undisciplined, illegitimate child named Block. And he's basically the same thing as Shapey, although the two look absolutely nothing alike. At the end of the episode, the new family moves away. However, they end up taking Shapey and leaving Block with the Puppingtons, and neither family really realizes. Only Orel and the Possible's daughter, Christina, actually recognize it, but they can never seem to tell their parents. And Block kinda has the same development as Shapey. He's loud, he's undisciplined, he's extremely rude, but nobody does anything to stop him. And of course, everyone except for those two I mentioned think that he's Shapey and not Block. However, in the Season 3 premiere, Numb, Bloberta finally figures out that Block isn't Shapey. So she calls Mrs. Possible to get the kids switched back. However, not everything goes according to plan. Shapey's happy to see his mom again, but Block doesn't run back to the Possible house. Instead, he chooses Bloberta, causing him to get abandoned by his real family and then becomes an honorary Puppington. Yeah, Bloberta just takes in both Shapey and Block. And the two of them cause unadulterated agony in the Puppington house from there on out, for a while. Before we get to that, let's talk about why Block might have chosen Bloberta over his real mom. So I have two theories for this. One, my first idea is that maybe somehow the Puppington house was a lot better than the Possible one. Specifically, maybe Bloberta actually treated Block better instead of like neglect. He maybe was used to abuse or something, I don't know. Or the more likely one, and the one that doesn't require overthinking things, maybe he just saw Shapey hug Bloberta and thought, cool, we're doing this now, not really realizing what he was doing. Either way, now he has two brothers instead of one sister. He and Shapey get in a lot of trouble but still become the best of friends. However, that's not really gonna last too long because of a lot of things that happen in the house. Clay ends up shooting Orel in the leg during the hunting trip. Not only that, but he finds Dr. Potter's Wheel's handkerchief, putting two and two together, realizing that Bloberta had been kinda cheating on him when he was away. As a result of this, as well as finally coming to terms with the fact that Orel is probably never going to be like him and is too sensitive for his own good, Clay kinda loses it as we see in the episode Sacrifice. He finally goes off on everybody and fully commits to being the awful person he always was deep down. What does this have to do with Shapey and Block? Well, back home, they're visibly worried about what's going on. They know that something's happening and that it's bad news. Shapey even tells his mom,
when I'm thirsty, it feels how I feel when I'm alone.
That's the first time Shapey has ever spoken coherently. But keep in mind, Shapey up until this point was basically a walking hurricane, causing nothing but destruction wherever he went. So now he's finally sensing the moment and realizing that things aren't really going to be the same ever again. And judging by the look on Block's face, he realizes it too. And I'm not the only one who thinks this too, because the series creator has actually confirmed it with one of the few episodes that we found out about that we weren't necessarily supposed to. In other words, he told us about an unproduced episode that never got to be. And this one was about Shapey and Block finally growing up and maturing as young boys. We don't have much information about this episode, but it seems like this moment from Sacrifice really started everything off. All we really have is that they bond. But we also have seen them bond in the very first episode where they became brothers. Not to mention the episode where Block was first introduced. So this could only mean that they bond over something like this. Otherwise, it'd just be kinda redundant. Besides, given the fact that Shapey and Block basically only speak in one-word sentences, you can't really have an entire episode with them bonding unless they actually talk. And with Shapey talking at the end of Sacrifice, this has to be what it means, right? And even in the last episode, Honor, yeah, they kind of slap each other around a little bit, but they're not doing things like licking lighters or sticking sewing needles in their eyes. They're just horsing around like little boys do. And when Clay and Bloberta are having their fight in the hallway of the apartment complex, they start caroling. Not screaming, not fighting or anything, they're just having fun, thinking that this is what the family's supposed to do. This might seem like I'm reading too deeply into it, but look at everything that Shapey and Block have done before. When Dr. Chosenberg is stuck in the hospital, Block desperately wants a drink, and starts fighting and screaming. Similarly, when Shapey's supposed to be waiting for Orel to get back with his Christmas gift, He goes off to the nativity scene and completely destroys it. See, doing something like this is not in either of their characters unless they grew up. And it's no secret given the fact that Moral Orel was cancelled early that we missed a lot of important stuff. For example, Bloberta was eventually supposed to get with Officer Papermouth, and Florence was supposed to lose weight and finally find happiness with Reverend Putty. Not to mention the thing that I mentioned in the last Moral Orel video, Miss Censordoll was eventually supposed to take over all of Moralton, usurping Clay's authority. We got this set up at the end of Nesting, and we never saw any follow-up because the show got cancelled the very next episode. Many others who reviewed the show have noted that the storylines were either cut short, were rushed, or were seemingly completed off-screen. And that seems to be what happened with Shapey and Block. But hey, at least we know for a fact they're okay now. Judging by Orel's wall when he's an adult, Shapey has now become a police officer and Block has now become a fireman. Both are occupations that require a severe amount of discipline. So yeah, they did grow up. They went from being nightmare boys to being respectable young men. I just wish we could have seen it. This is the show that made Nurse Bendy, who is basically a comic relief harlot character, extremely sympathetic. You feel for her when she's going through her issues in the episode alone. So to see them do the exact same thing with Shapey and Block, who have been nothing but background to comic relief characters at best, that would have been amazing. The signs were all there, and we have the beginning and end, just the middle was cut out. This is why I completely believe that if Moral Orel came out today, it would have been a gigantic success. And with the big underground movement that's starting to become mainstream, I don't see why Adult Swim doesn't give it another shot. I mean, come on, they're already focusing on heavy nostalgia stuff. That's what everyone's doing. Why not do Moral Orel as well? Especially with people begging and pleading for it to come back and finish what it started. And this is a guy who hates reboots talking, so you know it's severe. Either way, Shapey and Block were not only interesting characters when you look at their origins, but they also had some pretty good growth at the end of the show. It's too bad we weren't allowed to see it, though. We're going there, folks. Today's character quest is going to be all about Bloberta Puppington, and I bet a lot of you are wondering, wait a minute.
Wait a second.
Character quest is supposed to be about those characters that a lot of people don't understand or don't think are very deep. Everyone loves Bloberta and everyone loves picking her apart, so why is she here? First off, it's because, to be honest, I love making Moral Orel videos. In case you can't tell by the 2 others we made and the many more we have in the future, this is not gonna go away anytime soon. Also, nobody's really done a deep dive into Bloberta, at least that I could see, on a YouTube video, so here we go. It's time to get down and dirty, which I know she doesn't like, but still, we gotta do it. It's time to look at what makes Bloberta Puppington so broken. And the short answer is only 2 words. Clay Puppington. It's his fault she's like this. He's the reason that she's miserable, but she's not entirely innocent either. Before I discuss that, let's get into the bare basics. Bloberta is the mother of the Puppington household and she hates every minute of it. Now I'm sure she has some love for Orel and minimal love for Shapey. I don't even know how she feels about Block. Those two, never interact. But she's so checked out of this family and just wants to be done. Clay makes her miserable every hour of every day. He's a brute, he's a drunk, he's angry, he's stubborn, and he's neglectful, although she's not one to talk there. All she wants is an escape. Orel can't provide that, Shapey most certainly can't provide that, and Clay is the problem. So she whiles away her days cleaning everything in sight. Whether it be the floor, the walls, her own cleaning products, whatever it is, she has to clean it just so that she can stay busy. It's not that she's a neat freak or something, she just has to be useful because that's how she's raised. Bloberta grew up in a very abusive household that treated her like she was nothing. Her mother was an insane narcissist that loved her brother Lunchbox more than her and her older sister, and her father was basically not in the picture. He was there, but his presence was always seen and not heard and felt. Because she was so overlooked growing up, she had the unstoppable need to be helpful to somebody, that way she can finally be valued. For once, she can feel happy about herself, and for once, she can feel like she's not a waste of time and space. She thought Clay was gonna be exactly that, but it turns out that marrying him was a big, big mistake. She's helpful to him, yeah, but does he appreciate it? No. Does he hate her and every fiber of her being? Oh yeah, and he is not shy about it, so in short, Bloberta is stuck in her own personal hell. The only thing that she can do to get away is to die or run off with another guy. She tried doing that once too, and it didn't exactly work out. That man was Coach Stopframe, who was only pretending to be interested in her so that he could impregnate her and have a child so that he can get closer to Clay. However, that entire time, Bloberta thought that she finally found the one guy that would treat her like a real person and who would appreciate her help. Finally, she can find somewhere where she belongs and she can be happy for the very first time ever, but nope, it's all a lie. Stopframe broke it off, leaving Shapey behind, and as we've firmly established, Shapey is not exactly the most well-behaved child. He yells, he screams, he destroys everything, and Bloberta just doesn't care. Shapey is not only a constant reminder that she could have had a much better life, but also the fact that he's every parent's worst nightmare means that she wants nothing to do with him and constantly, accidentally I might say, throws him into harm's way by having a bunch of dangerous equipment in his room, and also doesn't really care when he gets hurt or nearly ingests chemicals. There's a fan theory going around that Bloberta actually does want Shapey dead, but I don't really know how I feel about that, so I'm not really going to discuss it here. She cares about Orel enough. She loves him, yeah, but still doesn't really give him a lot of attention. The only reason she cared about Orel being bullied was because he kept getting blood all over his shirts and she had to double her detergent budget when she did laundry. Oh no! And before Orel especially, there's a lot of signs that Bloberta really does care about Orel and wants the best for him. However, because she's so checked out of the family and wants to disassociate herself entirely, Orel's kind of collateral damage here. It's not like she wants to cut him out of her life, but that just goes along with the whole I don't want to be here thing. Orel gets dragged along for the ride and he doesn't really seem to notice, so I guess everyone wins? And I bet you're wondering, why doesn't she just try to patch things up with Clay? I mean, surely they could go to some kind of marriage counseling, right? No, that's not really possible for two reasons. One, if they went to marriage counseling, what would that say about their reputation? Bloberta and Clay really care about their reputation. If Moralton finds out they're having marital problems, then what are they gonna be? The subject of gossip, that's what. That's why they didn't get divorced at the end of the Christmas episode, by the way. They had to keep that image of the perfect 1950s household intact. And Bloberta's trying extra hard. We don't really know how much effort Clay's putting in, but we can clearly see how upset Bloberta is about it. First of all, look at her reaction when Clay comes home and God's blunders. Now that doesn't seem like forced happiness, does it? And secondly, especially in the third season, she proceeds to get more and more depressed the longer she's in this marriage. It gets to the point where we have episodes like Numb, where she has the house entirely to herself, except for Shapey, and decides to mutilate herself in order to get some amount of pleasure because no one else is giving it to her. Both physically and emotionally speaking, by the way. That's why she ends up having that semi-affair with Dr. Potter's wheel. And when she has that semi-affair, she has to cover it up in order to keep the image going, but I don't want to explain that because I'd be repeating myself. Let's get to the more important second point why she doesn't just try to make things up with Clay. His hatred for her cannot be stopped because of what she did to him. She ruined his life. And I'm not just saying this in the nice guy way of, oh, he got tied down when he didn't want to be. She's such a bad girl. Stay single, my kings. No, not like that. At Coach Fakey and Millie Sprayboot's wedding, Bloberta was having a very difficult time. All of her friends were about to get married. Meanwhile, she was single with no prospects of changing that, which, like I mentioned before, is a very big deal because she had to be useful and helpful to someone. And then she laid eyes on Clay, a single, young, dapper man who was sitting there in the church. She didn't know anything about him, but she knew she had to have him. So they started talking, and things were not really going the best. They were talking about a lot of awkward subjects, and their conversations kept stalling. And then she learned that Clay didn't drink, and she thought that was just the weirdest thing ever, so she kept pushing, and pushing, and pushing, and eventually got Clay to drink his first highball. and then another, and another, and another, and then bam, Clay became an alcoholic in one day. Yes, it's Bloberta that got Clay started on his alcoholism, but that's not enough. She heard that Clay wanted to be single for the rest of his life. Whether that's because he wanted to be celibate or because he was struggling with his bisexuality, we don't really know. But much like the drinks issue, she kept pressuring him, and eventually he broke down and decided to marry her. And even before they said I do, they were completely miserable. Clay blames her for ruining his life, and he will never, ever forgive her. Sometimes he'll even drink to try to have a better view of her, but no matter what, he always hates her and can barely even tolerate her. It never improves. And she knows it too, and you know what? I don't really feel bad for her because she should have seen this coming. Clay made a fool of himself when he was drunk at the reception. He kept drinking every drink in sight and hitting on any girl he saw. Bloberta had an out. She could have ran for the hills, but no, she didn't. She was so desperate and psychologically damaged that she felt that Clay was her only option. I mean, yeah, that's sad, but still, she ruined 2 lives just so that she could have some kind of comfy living or something, but she never really got that. Nor did she really get a happy ending either. See, Moral Orel ends without Bloberta finishing her character arc from Numb. It just kinda stops. She's eternally unfulfilled, unloved, and unhappy. The series ends with her being stuck in a loveless marriage with Clay until she dies, but that's not how it was supposed to end, no. Instead, she actually got a happy ending. Do you remember Officer Papermouth? The clumsy, dim-witted, but good-hearted policeman of Moralton? Well, his wife Florence divorced him, and he's been having a very difficult time. Take a look at him in Sacrifice if you don't believe me. Believe it or not, he was supposed to get together with Bloberta, and Bloberta for the very first time in her entire life felt real love and affection. It wasn't the one-sided fake stuff like with Stopframe, it was real love. It's never been made clear if they were going to end up staying together, but this is Moral Orel. They never cheap out on a story arc unless they have to, and that only really happens when the network cuts their season short. Do I want Bloberta to get a happy ending? Yes, no, it's hard to say. But if it gets Officer Papermouth to have a happy ending, then I guess it's worth it. And who knows? Maybe if she got together with Papermouth, she'd be a better mom to Orel, Shapey, and Block. And then she could finally leave Clay behind forever and start a whole new life, maybe even outside of Moralton. But no, that never happened. Instead, she did get the bad ending, which I think is partially deserved, but I don't know. Sometimes she's really sympathetic, but sometimes she's just awful. It's not like it depends on episode to episode, it just depends on what way you look at it. She's a girl who ruined someone's life just for the sake of comfort, but she's also someone who was psychologically damaged and didn't really know any better, and now that she's wised up, she desperately wants to leave, but has no chance of doing so. So where do you fit on this spectrum? Because I am honestly in the middle. It kind of depends on the day and what episode I watch. In episodes like Numb, oh yeah, I feel really bad for her and I wish that she could have a better situation. But in Help, not really. Still, that makes for a very interesting character, and it shows how great of a show Moral Orel was. It shows that not every character has to be black and white on the morality scale. They can be kinda gray. Some good, some evil, and that's real life too. Not everybody's wholly good and not everybody's wholly evil. But now, if you didn't already, I hope you can understand what makes Bloberta Puppington so broken. It's time for the big one. We talked about Bloberta a few days ago, so now we're going to talk about her husband, our main character's father, and the main villain of the entire show, Clay Puppington. The worst of the worst when it comes to Moralton residents. This guy is something else. A lot of people have a lot of theories and observations about Clay, but very few people have compiled them into one whole video. So now sit back and relax while we dissect Clay Puppington. Here we go. So first off, we have to start off with Clay's quote-unquote origin story, because every villain needs an origin story. Clay was the golden child of his household, but that's not saying a lot because he was the only child. Sort of. His dad seemed like a kind, respectable man who tried to be a good dad, but his mom, not so much. She kept losing child after child due to miscarriages caused by her drinking, smoking, and going on roller coasters. Yeah, that's a good sign. Oh boy. So when she didn't do any of that stuff when she was pregnant with Clay, Clay came out as a normal functioning boy. So she saw to change all of that. Clay became very self-absorbed as a child, making everything all about him. I know that that's usually a kid thing in general, but Clay took it to the next level. Everything always had to be about him, or the pictures had to involve him in some way. Definitely not a very considerate kid. And then when he realized that he was gonna have other siblings before his mother miscarried, he played a joke pretending to kill himself with a family gun. And this caused his mother to have a heart attack and die. Ever since then, Clay's dad hated Clay and slapped him around for every little thing. He blamed Clay for the death of his wife, and to be fair, that's not necessarily unfounded, but still, he's just a kid. At some point, Clay associated these frequent beatings and slappings with his father loving him, which isn't true at all. Like I said, his dad hates him and considers him a disappointment. He even decided to break a generations-long tradition of the Puppington family hunting trip just because he hated his son. Clay didn't really pick up on that because of his narcissism. His mother trained him to not see anybody hating him under any circumstances, so somehow, obviously, this has to be his dad's way of showing affection. And we can see this with how he treats Orel when he becomes an adult. He spanks Orel for basically every little mess up he does. Even for minor things like questioning his authority. And notice how he only does this to Orel? He doesn't do this to Shapey or Block, and definitely not Bloberta, showing that he hates them. He doesn't care about them at all. Like we discussed in their previous character quests, he sees Shapey as an illegitimate child and a constant reminder that his wife was unfaithful. And then Block just showed up out of nowhere and bam, second illegitimate child. Why would he want that? It's just another mouth to feed and he already is strapped for cash. And Bloberta ruined his life. He hates her with a burning passion, his number one least favorite person ever. Let's talk about that. Clay was a squeaky clean Mormon stereotype without the Mormonism, and Bloberta set eyes on him and knew that she had to make him hers. Why? Simply because he was a decent looking single man around her age and she was desperate to marry literally anybody. Clay never wanted to get married because, in his words, it wasn't something that would last. However, we now know, given what happened in the end of the show, this was also because he was struggling with his bisexuality. It's clear that a lot of the people of Moralton don't really look so kindly on that kind of stuff, so it was up to Clay to repress it all. But Bloberta struck anyways, and then kinda manipulated, kinda tricked Clay into marrying her, and immediately he knew that he was done for. His life, his plans, all gone. He was miserable before he even said, "I do." And ever since then, he's plotted not necessarily specific revenge, but just horrible, nasty thoughts against his wife. He also got hooked onto alcohol because of Bloberta and is now a barely functioning alcoholic. He drinks day in and day out to get his pain away, but it never works. In fact, it only makes things worse. He can have the occasional beer goggles that makes him see his family in a positive light, but as soon as they're gone, it doubles his pain every single time. And he takes it out on anybody he sees, especially his wife and kids. Of course, Bloberta is constantly neglected, but Orel? He not only spanks him, although in Clay's case, that's a sign of showing familial love. He also neglects Orel a lot. Whenever Orel says something like, "I love you, Dad," he'll always say something like, "Oh yeah, I'm hungry too," or "Yeah, that's good." He's got a complicated relationship with the boy that is often explored in very different ways throughout the series. He wants Orel to be a lot like him, basically mold him into a good, young Christian boy. And hey, if he also gets addicted to alcohol, whatever, that's not his fault. He did everything he could as the good, strong father. So he wants to parent Orel in that way, but he doesn't want to parent him in any other way at all. He doesn't really care about his friends or even want to meet them. He doesn't want to get involved in Orel's affairs, and he only wants to talk to Orel when Orel's screwing up in a way that affects him. And those of you who watch the show will probably wonder, how do things like raising the dead or smoking crack affect Clay at all? Well, that's because Clay values one thing above all else: his image. And that's not just because he's the mayor of Moralton, although we'll talk about that later. It's because he wants to have a good standing in the community. He wants to be that upstanding, good, righteous man. So if Orel's doing something to hurt his reputation, then he's gonna be very upset. Like in the episode Innocence, when he gets outraged because he has to take responsibility for giving Orel bad advice. This is also why he didn't divorce Bloberta in The Best Christmas Ever. He wanted to make sure that everyone in Moralton saw him as a good guy. And obviously, if he divorced his wife, that wouldn't be good at all. Even if it was for something like infidelity. Because if word got out that Bloberta cheated on him, how would that make him look? It would make him look weak, that's what. And he can't stand that at all. So that leads me to another part about Clay. It's his strange relationship with his family. I know I've kind of discussed how he's very distant, but there's also another aspect that was explored in Sacrifice. It's that he wants them all together as a unit, not because he wants it, but so that other people can't have it. This is most specifically relating to Bloberta. Now that he's married her, he doesn't want anyone else having her, or else he's gonna be seen as a failure. He only keeps her around just so that he can keep her away from other people. And this explains why he hates Shapey so much, because he's a constant reminder that he failed in his mission. Bloberta did go out and seek somebody else. She slept with them and had a kid, pretending all these years that he was Clay's, even though this whole time, Clay had a funny feeling. I mean, for one, he doesn't even remember conceiving Shapey, and two, Shapey doesn't look anything like him. But who does Shapey look like? Oh, that's who. Danielle Stopframe, Clay's best friend and pseudo-lover. Clay, like I said, is a bisexual man, and he struggles with that, trying to repress it, but also having these unbeatable feelings that he has to get out, especially because his home life is so terrible that, essentially, Danielle here, who he's desperately in love with, is his escape, and Stopframe knows this full well. He's been trying to destroy Clay and Bloberta's marriage for at least 7 years, because he's the one that sought Bloberta out and then wanted to have a kid with her just so that he could get close to Clay. Throughout the show, it was constantly teased that Clay maybe knows what Stopframe did and maybe knows how he feels, but he can't really act on that despite feeling the same way. They were mostly used as jokes throughout the show. But then the infamous 3rd season rolled around and we started exploring this as a legitimate character trait for not only Clay, but Stopframe as well. Maybe we'll give Stopframe his own character quest, who's to say? But right now we're talking about Clay. Hey, that rhymes. We see Clay struggling more and more with who he is right now and who he wants to be. Of course, we don't feel anything for him because he's a terrible, awful, irredeemable person, and he gets exactly what he deserves. What is it? Well, we'll discuss that towards the end, because right now, we have to talk about Clay's development throughout the series. In the first season, Moral Orel was strictly a comedy with some minor character elements here and there. He basically served to be Orel's disciplinarian dad who gave him some really strange life advice. And then as the 2nd season rolled around, we got to see just how much of a tightwad, an angry man, and abusive husband he is. And then nature happens, where he takes Orel on the father-son hunting trip, the same one that he never got to go on with his dad because he decided to pick the tradition right back up. Here, he finally opens up to Orel about just how miserable he is, only for him to shoot Orel in the leg and not care at all. Partially because he's drunk and also partially because, it's not his problem. He's not the one who got shot. This causes Orel to see Clay as the man he truly is for the very first time in his entire life. And from then on, their relationship would never be the same ever again. And of course, a lot of season 3 takes place before the hunting trip, and even then, we get to see a lot of the darker sides of Clay. Like how when he was preparing Orel for the hunting trip, he decided to favor Doey instead of him, and then later told Doey to his face that the whole thing was just a ploy to get Orel to be a better shot. Or when Orel has a vision about heaven, he literally beats it out of him. In the penultimate episode, Nesting, he and Orel have their very first fight. It becomes clear to Clay that he can no longer scare Orel into doing what he wants. That and his spankings no longer have any effect on him. In fact, Orel just doesn't care about them at all. Gone are the days where he had any respect for his son and where he could mold him into a little version of himself. He's now entirely powerless, without an ally in this war zone of a house. And what does he do? He tells Orel that he's glad he shot him. Yeah, that's what he says to his own son. As if things couldn't get worse, huh? At least he's got Danielle, right? Not necessarily, because he screws that up as well. Miss Censordoll was running against Clay to become mayor of Moralton because, let's face it, Clay isn't the best leader. He's corrupt, he's lazy, and he's only doing the job for the money. However, Censordoll realizes that Clay has an Oedipus complex and decides to exploit it. Clay ends up going along with it too, and in public no less. He's not really attracted to her, like, at all. He just wants to do this so that she can stop bothering him when he's doing his marital duties. Danielle sees this, and then a light bulb goes off in his head. Just like Orel, he sees just how bad of a person Clay is. In fact, he and Orel end up bonding over it and become good friends. Clay sees this and becomes extremely jealous. And when he goes over to Danielle's apartment to confront him, he accidentally confesses his love, but then decides to double down and say yes, this is how he feels, and he's ready to leave Bloberta for him. Only problem is, it's too late. Danielle's no longer interested and doesn't want anything to do with him ever again, so he has to leave and then never talk to the one he loves ever again. And this is where Clay's arc ends. He no longer has the respect of any of his kids, the one he loves, the community, and also he's stuck in a marriage that he can't stand. He and Bloberta are doomed to spend eternity together because they don't want to risk ruining their image, at least more so than it already has been, and he certainly doesn't have any other prospects, so what's he gonna do? Be alone forever? That's not a good look. Although this wasn't really gonna be the end for Clay. Had the show gone on, he was gonna be forever alone. Not alone with Bloberta, just alone in general. Bloberta was eventually gonna fall in love with Officer Papermouth, and they were gonna find a legitimately happy relationship. And it's also assumed that she would have ran off with him and started a new family. So as soon as he gets rejected by Coach Stopframe, that's it. Just like what he wanted in Help, he's gonna be alone by himself with the Bible, only this time, he's come so far since then that that's no longer what he wants. But there's nothing he can do about that now because, as Coach Stopframe said, it's too late. So either way, Clay was doomed to have an unhappy ending, whether Moral Orel was cancelled or ended naturally, so yeah. He does get his just desserts in the end. Honestly, I gotta say, Clay is my favorite character in the entire show. Not because he's a good person, I think we can all agree he's like the worst in the show, but it's because he's so fascinating. Literally everything he does is evil. He hasn't done one nice thing in the entire run of the show. I tried to find some, trust me, I looked all over and I couldn't find any. He's such an irredeemable monster, but he's so fascinating to just dissect and look at all the layers surrounding him because, as Clay says, he poisons everyone else around him, so obviously, he's the center of all the Moral Orel development. Take a look at all the characters we talked about before. Shapey, Block, Bloberta, Miss Censordoll, even Orel. All of their development comes from him. If Clay wasn't the way he was, this show wouldn't be nearly as good, but because he is, and because he's just that terrible, Moral Orel is one of the greatest Adult Swim shows that ever was. He makes the show worth watching, and I think more people need to give him the credit that he deserves. I can't believe we've been talking about Moral Orel for 14 months, and we've never once made a character quest on Orel himself. Well, time to fix that, right? Orel Puppington is one of the best written characters in the entire show, but I don't really think that should surprise you because he's the main character. Of course he's going to be well written. He's the one who has the most development and growth. And boy, does he ever grow. Orel has always been a kind-hearted, good-natured young man. He always wants to do what's right in the eyes of God, as well as making people around him feel happy. He doesn't have a mean bone in his body. At least, not an intentionally mean one, because Orel tends to do some pretty nasty things. Like, I don't know, beating up his friends and family because he wants to teach them about turning the other cheek? Raising the dead and sending an army of zombies to harass Moralton with their nakedness? And getting his friends to slit their wrists so he can bathe in their blood?
Dude, this is pretty f***ed up right here.
But even though he does these pretty bad things, he still tries to do what's right. The show's called Moral Orel for a reason, because in his eyes, he thinks he's doing the right thing. That is until Clay brings him to his study and spanks some sense into him, but still, Orel never intends to do something wrong. Speaking of Clay, it's a wonder how Orel became as good-natured of a person as he is. He grew up in a dark and miserable household run by two negligent parents, with Bloberta being cold and distant and Clay being, well, a monster. Orel could have been on the fast track towards failure. But no, as we've seen in Before Orel, his naivete and willingness to do the right thing has always been around. And this is right around the time when he discovered God. Thanks to Clay being pressured by Miss Censordoll, Orel ended up getting a somewhat comprehensive Bible lesson from Clay, and he immediately fell in love with the Christian religion. But given Orel's natural obliviousness, he started to misinterpret the Bible very quickly. In fact, within a few short days, he was willing to sacrifice his little brother Shapey, just like Abraham did with Isaac. Luckily, he got stopped at the last minute, but this solidified his faith 100%. To Orel, Shapey getting rescued from being slaughtered was proof that God is real. So Orel became a devoted follower from that day on. And like I mentioned earlier, he never grew out of misinterpreting things and going way too far. In fact, that's kind of what the town expects from him going forward. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but it gets to the point in Season 3 where everyone basically blames Orel for all the town's problems, even if he's not actually the cause of them. The musical episode. With Orel basically being the town menace, it's up to Clay, his loving and devoted father, to set him straight. And he does, in very strange ways. The only thing that Clay really seems to take pride in when it comes to his son is the fact that he can impart his wisdom onto the next generation. And of course, Orel eats them all up, taking them to heart without questioning them whatsoever. And that's really dangerous because what Clay teaches is far from the truth. Like a lot of the people of Moralton, the way that Clay views the world is warped and twisted. And he's trying to impart that onto Orel. Orel, being the trusting kid that he is naturally going to accept this because it comes from his father. His father's the best person in the world. He would never betray him or lie to him. Why does he have any reason to question what Clay says? Clay is the moral guardian of Orel's life, basically the arbiter of what's right and what's wrong. Throughout the first 2 seasons, Orel lives a relatively happy life. Even if he messes up, that's all part of growing up, right? You gotta learn some lessons, gotta put some hair on your chest. Though from an outsider looking in, you'd kinda have to question why Orel's so happy. Simply put, the reason he sees the world is different from most other people. He sees Clay as a devoted father figure who's always there to help him. He sees Bloberta as a kind and loving mother who's actually attentive. And he sees Shapey and or Block as the mischievous little brother who's always trying to get away with something. This meshes perfectly with the kind of image that Moral Orel Season 1 is trying to set up. A generally functional, overall sustainable quality of life. And even if there are some cracks here and there, those are probably normal. There's no reason to draw attention to those. And boy, do those cracks ever show up. At the end of the best Christmas ever, Orel learns that Clay and Bloberta are planning to get divorced. So what does Orel do? Does he break down and cry? Does he go through a depressive spiral? No, he just smiles, looks up to the heavens, and prays. All he can do is think positive and believe that the problem's gonna work itself out over time. Not even the Shapey and Block switch could bum him out. In fact, he seems to roll with it quite well. He may never see his brother again, and he has this totally new but also kind of the same brother. And the worst reaction he has to that is trying to tell people, hey, that's not Shapey. But then when they don't react or when they cut him off, he moves on. That's it. Throughout seasons 1 and 2, I'm sure if you asked Orel, if he was real, he'd probably say that the worst thing he ever went through was getting grounded from church. Yes, I know that's a Season 3 episode, but it happens during the events of Season 2, so yeah. But that's when nature comes into play. Everything changes here once and for all. Clay decides to reignite the family tradition of taking the eldest son out for the Puppington family hunting trip, and Orel comes back a changed kid. He does not see his family the same way that he used to. For the very first time, he's forced to look at Clay dead on. No rose-colored glasses, no manipulation, nothing is clouding his vision. He sees Clay for what he truly is. A damaged man, yes, but one who's decided to use his damage as a weapon. Instead of getting better, he just decides to wallow in his misery and take out said misery on everybody else. The trip didn't even start well with Clay throwing out everything that Orel packed except his lucky shirt. But Orel seemed to kind of take it in stride. That is until Clay gets drunk, and he has that infamous and really compelling monologue that scares Orel to his core. He's never seen Clay like this before. He had no idea that his father was feeling all these things. And then, Orel gets shot. By his own dad. I'm sure that if Clay swooped in and tried to heal Orel or take him to the hospital all while screaming, "What have I done?" I'm sure Orel would have forgiven him in time. But no, Clay doesn't do that. He drinks the rubbing alcohol that Orel was going to use to clean his wound, rips Orel's lucky shirt to tie around the wound, and then goes right to sleep. Yeah, so what if his kid's bleeding out? Who cares if he's in excruciating pain? He's got to get his sleep. And Orel says the 3 words that I don't think he said to anybody before in his entire life.
I hate you.
This marks the end of their father-son bond. After this point, Orel becomes completely ambivalent to whatever his dad says. Whether he praises him, bribes him, threatens him, he gets no reaction. Orel is done with Clay, absolutely done. The two of them keep growing further apart, with Orel supporting Miss Censordoll's bid for becoming Mayor of Moralton instead of Clay, Orel hanging out with Stopframe all the time, and even badmouthing Clay behind his back, saying that there's nothing honorable about him. Orel still has his kindly demeanor and all, and he's still a chipper, happy kid, but his home life isn't the same. He even says as much in the episode Sacrifice. Now we're gonna have to pause here because from here on, this is where things get a little, fuzzy, I guess you could say. The rest of Orel's arc never made it to screen. Yes, the show got canceled before the main character could finish his character arc.
Isn't that just swell?
In the later seasons, and by this I mean 4 and 5, Arthur Puppington, Clay's father and Orel's grandfather, would have become a major character. It would be revealed that Arthur was diagnosed with a terminal illness and he would decide to spend the rest of his days in the Puppington household. Here, he becomes the first real parental figure that Orel has ever had. From the descriptions of the episode that we got later on, it seems to be implied that Arthur would have helped Orel become a lot more streetwise. He wouldn't trust everything and anything just because he can and probably should, even though he really shouldn't. He would finally be able to judge for himself whether a person was good or not. One of the episodes in particular really catches my attention. It's one where Arthur teaches Orel how everyone in Moralton, despite claiming that they're the best people ever, are actually quite horrible. Even Reverend Putty, like we talked about a few months ago, even he's not a great person when you get down to it. Him being morally gray and kind of center-ish makes him one of the better people in the town by default and default only. This could be a real eye-opener for Orel. Here he was, growing up his entire life believing that he should be just like people like Clay, or Coach Stopframe, or Principal Fakey. But they're the exact opposite kind of people that a young Christian should strive to be like. Then, Arthur dies, and Orel goes through a massive depression, to the point where he goes goth for a while, but I guess it's just a phase because he's not like this in any other episode. Sort of like with Shapey and Block in the episodes Honor and Abstinence, we can see Orel's behavior change in the final episode, as if all this development happened and we all knew what it was. The Orel we see in Honor is not the same one we got in the likes of, say, God's Chef or The Best Christmas Ever. He's a bit more aware of the world and knows how to judge people, but he's still that chipper, upbeat kid he's always been. And probably always will be. And yes, I do mean kid because I'm sure we can all agree that when Orel grows up, he's basically gonna be a big kid at heart. Oh right, I guess I should talk about Orel growing up before this video's over, huh? Yes, despite living with Clay and Bloberta his entire life, despite all the terrible things that have happened to him and the terrible things he's done, Orel grows up to have a loving, happy family. One with the girl that he's always loved, and he gets to have a dog and keep it this time. It sure was a lot of struggling, but Orel got the good ending. He, Shapey, and Block seem to be the only ones that really did. And you know, I think he deserves it. Does he always do the right thing? Absolutely not. But is he a good person? Yeah, of course. At least when you don't look at his actions. Despite the fact that he's basically living in a totalitarian hell on earth, Orel remains a good-hearted, kind person who's always out there to help a friend in the most unorthodox ways possible. Which I think is why we keep coming back again and again. So, this is a first for a moral Orel character quest. In the past, we've only talked about the Puppington family, except for Orel. But guess what? We're still not talking about Orel, just wait until November, don't worry. Right now, we're talking about Reverend Putty. Reverend Putty is the town's spiritual leader. He provides the sermons in town that everybody has to go hear unless they want to suffer the dreaded penalty of shunning. But just because he's Moralton's main religious leader doesn't really mean that he's objectively a good person. I wouldn't say he's bad. He's not up there with the likes of, say, Coach Stopframe, Miss Censordoll, or Clay. I'd say that Reverend Putty's in more of a gray area. He's someone with good intentions and overall a good heart. But he lets his personal insecurities and character flaws overcome him a lot, which causes him to make his fair share of mistakes. But before we get into that, let's talk about who Rod Putty is in general. On Sunday mornings, he's an upright, pious, religious man. Someone you can come to when you're feeling lost or guilty, and he'll point you right back to the good old God path. Outside of church, though, he's a sad, lonely, desperate man. Because he's spent most of his time working in the church and striving for godly things, he's forgotten to build up a social circle. He doesn't really have very many friends or associates outside of church, and he most certainly doesn't have a wife. The reason I point that out in particular is because that's what he does all the time. Putty is cripplingly lonely, and that's his main character trait. This loneliness causes him to become a really distant, bitter man. When he gives his sermons, he seems very kind and compassionate. However, when you come talk to him outside of church, it's exactly the opposite. Take, for example, when Principal Fakey's having trouble with his marriage because he accidentally keeps cheating on his wife with Nurse Bendy. And yes, those are big air quotes around accidentally, and I hope the editor put that on the screen, but we'll talk more about that when we get to Principal Fakey, because yes, we're gonna talk about him too. Here, Putty lets his jealousy control him. He's not here to help Principal Fakey, he's not here to set him right. All he's gonna do is sit in the repressional and just gripe about how Principal Fakey's life is so much better than his. He's got a wife and a mistress when he, a perfectly amazing, handsome, talented, thoughtful, nice guy, has absolutely nobody. And yes, it's true, Rod Putty is in fact a nice guy. I mean, have you seen how he tries to pick up women, especially his own daughter?
Would you like to meet for lunch sometime?
Sure, I could eat. How's now?
Now's a little soon.
No, I mean tomorrow. Now. What is now? That's ridiculous. I don't even know what now means. Is now even a word? Let me take it for a little test drive. Now. Nope, doesn't mean a thing. Tomorrow.
And of course, when he gets rejected, he gets all sulky, but in this case, it's for a different reason, but more on that in a bit. Putty is a godly man, and he is dedicated to his craft. But that comes with a limit. Just like a lot of people in Moralton, he's willing to throw every single one of his Christian values aside in order to get what he wants. Take, for example, the episode Presents for God. He has sex with 3 different hookers just because, hey, he's gotta get that virgin rage out somehow. That sounded a lot more Christian-y than I originally thought it would, but oh well, moving on. It just goes to show that even the most supposedly godly men in all of the city don't really have that strong of a connection to their biblical values. In fact, Orel is probably a better pastor than he is. So obviously, given the fact that he's a really desperate guy, he'll take any woman that comes to him, right? Nope. Because in addition to being a nice guy, Reverend Putty's also a choosing beggar. He claims that he just wants any woman and he wants to just settle down and have a family and be just like Clay and Bloberta, having that happy, perfect, loving marriage. Poor guy. If only he knew. There is one woman in Moralton that's very interested in Reverend Putty. It's the recently divorced Florence Papermouth. She is absolutely obsessed with Putty and everything he says. She's basically his #1 fan. But does Reverend Putty ever consider going out with her? Nope. She's too big for him, so he decides to pass her by. Especially when it comes to her roommate and sort of friend, it's hard to explain, Dottie. Since Dottie's more conventionally attractive, Reverend Putty will automatically go after her. Even though, if you really sat down to think about it, Dottie is a really nasty and selfish person and Florence would give anyone the shirt off her back. But that doesn't matter to him because all he really wants is short-term gratification. He might try to convince himself or others that he wants the big picture marriage thing, and maybe deep down he does. But when it comes to being in the heat of the moment or the possibility of actually having a chance with a girl, he'll think with his lower half before his upper half, and that tends to ruin everything. It takes away all of his happiness in the episode Sundays. We get to see just how long Florence has been going after Reverend Putty. And of course, whenever she shows interest, he always turns her down, and whenever Dottie's near, clearly shows favoritism towards her. But it's Florence that he gets into bed with one night, until he screams Dottie's name. We're gonna touch on this moment more in Florence and Dottie's character quests, but for Reverend Putty, he knows he royally screwed up. I know a lot of you haven't read the Narcissism script yet, and don't worry, our production of that animatic is still going according to plan, but Putty eventually realizes that deep down, he actually does love Florence, and he loves her for the inside traits, not the outside, even though, according to the creator, she was eventually gonna lose weight before they got together, but yeah, oh well. This was going to be the conclusion of Putty's arc. He was going to stop viewing people with such a superficial lens. We were going to see this the most strongly with Florence. By actually getting to know her and thinking more about his connection with her, he realizes that she's the one he wants to be with, not someone as vapid as Dottie. And who knows, this might have ended up leading him to become a better Reverend. But that's kind of speculation at this point. It's a shame that we never really got a whole lot of it though. The most we got was his relationship with his daughter, Stephanie. Because yes, he does have a daughter. So let's discuss that, why don't we? Because that's a really important part of Putty's growth. In the episode Be Fruitful and Multiply, Orel finally convinces his friend Stephanie to come to church with him, but Stephanie doesn't want to go because she wants to learn more about God. She wants to learn more about Rod. See what I did there? As it turns out, Rod Putty is actually her father, but he has no idea. They meet up together and Putty thinks that this is a date because of course he does, it's Reverend Putty, come on. And there he shows just how inept he is at talking with women. And he's all excited to talk to her and probably even more until he realizes, surprise, Stephanie's his daughter. But that's impossible because he's a virgin. Except what happened was that this crazy woman named Gladys Foamwire ended up sneaking into Reverend Putty's house, taking his, sample from his Lonely Night tissues, and ended up conceiving a daughter through that said sample. And Putty doesn't take this well at all. Not because his daughter is quote-unquote godless and sinful, not because she runs the local sex shop in Moralton, no, because he got a daughter without getting to enjoy creating her. He feels like he got robbed of a sexual experience, and that's why he wants nothing to do with her at all. Once again, this shows just how narrow Reverend Putty's view really is. This could be a cure to his loneliness, although not really in the way that he originally thought or wanted, but he'd finally be able to have a companion, someone he could talk to when he feels lonely or someone to possibly give him advice. Given that he's the go-to religious leader of the town, who's gonna be there to help him when he's in trouble? But no, that's not what he wants, so he decides to cut her out. Until he does a little bit more thinking and decides, yeah, I'll give her a shot. Let's start a father-daughter bond. And despite the fact that Stephanie is basically the opposite of what the people of Moralton view as a good person, they get along really well. And Putty's able to put aside his long-standing homophobia for the sake of his daughter. Back when Stephanie was in high school, she had a crush on Doey's future mother, Kim. But Kim basically treated it all like a giant joke. Stephanie ended up getting her heart broken, and when Putty discussed it with her years later, he revealed that he felt bad for her that day because he could tell that Kim never really cared about her. Of course, if anybody heard him say that, he would be immediately stripped of his post, but that doesn't matter. He wants to show his daughter that he cares about her regardless of what anybody else says, and at the end of the day just wants her to be safe and happy. Not settle for a woman who would treat her like a gigantic joke. This is the first instance where Reverend Putty's heart ends up overpowering his flesh. He's finally getting in touch with his emotions and therefore actually helping somebody. He's not just standing up at the pulpit going, oh yes, this is what you must do, and now watch as I immediately don't do that, but please ignore that because I'm such a great religious leader, please date me. Who knows? Maybe this is how he would have been by the end of the series had it actually gotten completed. But as it stands, it's kind of implied. Kind of like what we discussed with Shapey and Block and their progression. It's more left to context clues and subtle changes to their personality as time goes on. Putty's kind of the same way. He did his job well enough, and basically in Moralton that's all that can be expected of somebody, but then when he got out of the church, the reverend part of him was gone, and instead he became a bitter, angry loner. But as time went on, some very important people would get introduced to his life. While at first he wouldn't want anything to do with them, he would slowly but surely let them into his life, and change him for the better. This shows that Reverend Putty isn't a lost cause. You look at someone like, say, Clay or Bloberta and say, yeah, they're too far gone. They've done so many terrible things and have been so damaged in their past that they're basically beyond saving. You look at someone like Coach Stopframe and go, yeah, he's done so many awful things, and even his change at the end was only caused by him losing what was close to him and what he valued most. And do I even need to say anything about Censordoll? This is why I don't think Putty's a bad guy. His sermons may be lip service sometimes, and he doesn't go the extra mile for the people in his congregation, but deep down, despite all his faults, he's mostly a good person. And that's more that can be said about the rest of the town, let me tell you. So that's Reverend Putty, a lonely man who lets his weaknesses get the better of him until he sinks so low that he decides to take matters into his own hands and turn his life around, even if we didn't get to see it. For the most part, the characters we've covered in these moral oral character quests have been less than upstanding people. But that's just the way things go in Moralton. Almost everybody's at least some kind of evil. We have child predators like Mr. Creepler, we have people that systematically destroy families like Coach Stopframe, and then we have Miss Censordoll, who's all kinds of messed up. Many, including myself, have pointed to Orel and called him the one good person in the entire town. And that's kind of true. Orel is a being of pure innocence who can't do anything wrong, at least intentionally. But if we had to pick someone else other than Orel to be the quote-unquote good person of the town, that just might have to be Stephanie Putty. To put it simply, Stephanie here is the woman on the outside. She's everything that Moralton hates. She's a free-thinking, liberal, heavily pierced lesbian who runs a sex shop in the seedy part of town. For the most part, she's kept at a distance, but when the people of Moralton need her services, suddenly she's the go-to person to help them with their needs. So many things in her life should have made her a really depressed, angry, bitter person, but no. She's managed to overcome all these bad things and has become a legitimately good person. Even if she did give Orel a piercing in his area, that part's a little questionable, but everything else she does in the show is just fine. Firstly, Stephanie was raised by, let's be real, a crazy lady. This is Gladys Foamwire, and according to Reverend Putty, she's a religious nut, and that means something in Moralton. I can't imagine what it must have been like for Stephanie to be growing up and finding out that she disagrees with everything that the town holds dear, all while being raised by the town's biggest cheerleader and fanatic. If this woman's crazy enough to stalk Reverend Putty, steal his tissues, and create an illegitimate child, who knows what she could have done. No matter what happened though, it wouldn't deter Stephanie from being who she is. She's very forthright and open about what she believes. She'll call a spade, maybe even worse than a spade, and that's because to her, self-expression is one of the most important things there is. Especially in an environment where everybody has to think and feel the same way about everything. Which probably explains why she looks the way she does. Gotta stick it to Moralton, you know? And this kind of free-thinking, rabble-rousing behavior would most certainly draw ire from all the town's leaders. She's shunned and is considered an outcast and a monster and a heathen. Someone who would belong in Sinville and not their precious, wonderful, perfect little town. After a while, this has got to get to you, but Stephanie rarely ever shows it. The way she talks about Moralton makes it clear that she's above all this petty squabbling and drama. None of that's important to her. She's gonna focus on being her best self, and no one's gonna stop her. Though that's got to be a very isolated existence. She doesn't really have any friends or people to rely on, at least before she meets Orel, so she's just there, in her shop. But then when she does meet Orel, something strange happens. She meets someone who's a legitimately good person and who won't judge her for being different. It's because of this the two strike up a really close bond. In exchange for Orel not judging her, her beliefs, or her lifestyle, she never judges anything that Orel says or the kind of situations he gets himself into week after week. A mutual understanding between two misfits. And thanks to Orel, she's able to expand her social circle a little bit more when she finally meets her dad. And that dad just so happens to be Reverend Putty. This, on paper, sounds like a disaster. Reverend Putty, while technically being one of the better people in the town, is one of the main people that Moralton rallies behind in order to get its spiritual guidance. A lot of the bile that they spew and the hatred that they feel, they can come from Putty's sermons. Even if he has a good reaction to hearing that she's his daughter, who's to say that the town would respond just as nicely? We can see that whenever Moralton's beliefs are challenged, or whenever they find something that they don't like, they will do whatever they can to either fix the problem or dispose of it. Like in Before Orel, when Orel was questioning God, an emergency midnight sermon was put into place to change Orel's mind. And in Geniuses, when the leaders of Moralton weren't able to hide evidence of the missing link, they threw him in the freezer hoping that he would never be found again. Connecting with her father could have been a very dangerous thing for Stephanie to do, but once again, she's above whatever Moralton can come up with. She's gonna do what's best for her. And while at first things don't go well between them, especially with the Reverend trying to hit on someone who keeps saying, "I'm your daughter," the two end up hitting it off and have a proper father-daughter relationship. In Close Face, Reverend Putty also kind of implies that he's a little bit more accepting of Stephanie's lifestyle than he lets on. After a long wait, Stephanie finally has people to rely on, and in turn has people to rely on her. Given that she was ignored, hated, betrayed, and maybe worse considering Gladys Fomeyer, she should have been in the prime position to become the atheist Clay. But in fact, she ended up being the opposite. She's always there to help a friend in need and give some sage advice. Like in Narcissism, when Reverend Putty was battling with his feelings for Florence, she's the one who told him, "You gotta be honest with how you feel. Talk to her, and maybe she'll respond well." And wouldn't you know it? She did. Sort of. She also helped Orel with his prayer competition, and while yes, that kind of got him in trouble, that wasn't her fault, that was because of the town's closed-minded nature. And maybe it's just me, but I have a feeling that if some of the other townspeople opened up to her, she might want to help them out as well. This is for two reasons. One, she wants to undo all the stuff that happened to her. The way I see it, she's paying it forward. If she could be nice to somebody, maybe they can pass it on, and then that person will pass it on, and they'll pass it on, and eventually Moralton really will be a nice place to live. No more judgment, no more hatred, everybody's a friend of everybody else, and most importantly, they practice what they preach. No longer is Christianity just an excuse to justify their bad behavior. The people of Moralton can legitimately be good people. And it all stems from a sense of forgiveness that comes from being beyond this kind of craziness that dwells in the town. And the other reason I think she'd help other people out is because, well, her line of work is kind of revolved around not judging other people. She runs Moralton's sex shop, so she knows a lot about some of the darker sides of the people in town. She also knows who her clients are, and if word got out, that would be really devastating for their all so important reputations. Let me put it this way, even though Moralton's supposed to be this fine upstanding community, they give Stephanie's store enough business to keep it afloat. So that means there's got to be tons of these quote-unquote righteous people flocking to her store and buying the crazy thing she's got hidden in the back. She has this community nuke, and she's not gonna use it. Way to go, Stephanie, taking the high road. Stephanie, I'm sure, would have had a lot more to do had the series gone on. As it stands, despite being one of the most popular and recognizable characters in the show, she barely has any appearances of substance. The only time she appears in something beyond a cameo are The Blessed Union, Be Fruitful and Multiply, Close Face, and Narcissism, and that last one wasn't even completed until We Here made that animatic. Personally, I would have liked to have seen her mix some more with the town, especially the women who would not take kindly to her free-thinking liberal nature. But as I tend to say whenever we talk about a character with either an unfinished or unmade storyline, we have to take what we can get. And what we've got is a really down-to-earth, likable character with a lot of layers. What she lacks in screen time, she makes up for her genuine personality and her ability to set an example to the future generation. Specifically Orel, because I don't think Doey's gonna be running around that store anytime soon. Despite all the hardships she's endured and all the isolation she's been subjected to, Stephanie Putty remains one of the best people in town. However, because she's different and socially unacceptable, she will always remain the woman on the outside. As we've discussed many times on this channel, the town of Moralton is full of people that use their religion to justify their bad deeds. All of their flaws are ignored because they're authority figures and they're righteous ones at that. Therefore, they're completely infallible. But what happens when someone in Moralton is a terrible person, but they don't use religion to cover it up? That is the case with Coach Danielle Stopframe. Yes, his name is Danielle, not Daniel. Just thought I'd mention that before I get actually'd in the comments. Some of you might be thinking, what's so bad about this guy? In a town full of clays, Blobertas, Potter's Wheels, Censordolls, how does this guy stand out?
Let me talk to you.
For a bit over 7 years, Danielle Stopframe has been systematically destroying the Puppington household for one reason and one reason only. He is an incredibly selfish person. You see, Stopframe has his eyes set on Clay Puppington. He is madly in love with him and won't take no for an answer. Though it's not exactly like Clay is saying no, it's just that Clay's situation prevents the two of them from being together, and Stopframe isn't having it. In fact, he is so not having it that he's trying to destroy everything around Clay, so that Clay will have nowhere to turn to but him, then at long last, Clay will be all his. The plan is basically, hit on Bloberta, who he knows is unhappy in her marriage with Clay, sleep with her, have her conceive his child, and then run away. This kid, of course, turns out to be Shapey. The end result, of course, is intended to be Clay finding out that Shapey is not his kid, and then running away from Bloberta, right into Stopframe's arms. However, upon writing the script, I realized that there are actually some unintended consequences to this plan if it ever were to succeed. Moralton is not exactly the most upstanding and accepting community. When they find out that Clay Puppington, their mayor, left his happy wife and his lovely children to be with this guy, they're not gonna take it well at all. Not only do they not like gay people in general, tolerance is just a theme, right? But when they find out that this is their elected leader who's doing this, one that they trusted to help steer the town in a good direction, and one who's an extremely visible public servant, this is like their worst nightmare. Everything around Clay would implode. Even though he hates his stinking dead-end job, it's still a job and he needs it to survive. He would probably have to leave office, or if not, he would never be able to win again, and he'd also have a difficult time finding a job after that. And finally, anyone who wants to be seen as a decent person, or at the very least not be harassed by Censordoll, would want to keep clear of moral degenerates like these. Which means that Clay would only have Stopframe. It's just the two of them. Forever. Let me be clear, I don't think that Stopframe is aware that these side effects could easily happen, but at the same time, I think that if he did know, he wouldn't care. If anything, they might make him happier because it gives him more access to Clay. We've seen that Stopframe doesn't exactly have a conscience when he realizes he's done something wrong. For example, in the episode Numb, Bloberta seeks him out to hopefully restart their love affair, but he shuts her down. After seeing how miserable this makes her, he point blank tells her he doesn't care, and then he laughs. Why would Clay be any different? If you say it's because he loves Clay, I disagree. Stopframe doesn't love Clay. In fact, I'd even say that he doesn't even know him. What Stopframe is experiencing is carnal lust. He found someone that's attractive and that's pleasant to be around, and that's the extent of it. That's all he really sees. Firstly, it's implied in Before Orel and God's Greatest Gift that Clay has no idea who Stopframe is, which means that, yes, Stopframe decided to destroy the life of a stranger purely because he thought he was hot. Over time, of course, the two would end up becoming friends and drinking buddies, and they both secretly wanted more. Clay, being a devoutly religious man and someone who's very concerned about his standing in the community, obviously wouldn't want this to be public, while Stopframe, someone who doesn't really know what he believes and changes his system depending on what he wants and what he gets, he couldn't care less. So he'll keep pushing and enabling Clay's bad behavior, all while ignoring any consequences. And of course, in the series finale, Honor, he catches Clay making out with Miss Censordoll and loses his mind because, gasp, Clay isn't the person he thought he was. He's actually a terrible person. Who could have guessed? This is why I say that Stopframe never really knew Clay. He only ever knew the face that Clay would put on when he's in a social scene. It's like what we talked about in Clay's character quest. Clay disguises himself as a modest, genuine, and overall pleasant person, and it's only when you get to know him do you get to see the demons inside. Stopframe never got to that point because he never really stopped to think about Clay or his feelings or his past or what's going on inside that crazy head of his. All he cares about is, what can I get out of this relationship? How can I benefit? He even does this to Orel in the aforementioned Honor episode. No, don't worry, it's nothing sexual. The show never gets into that, at least with children. Unless you count Mr. Creepler. Never mind. Anyways, Orel is going through a hard time because he, just like Stopframe, realized that after all this time, Clay has never been a good person. So, rather than try to help Orel cope with the situation or help him find something honorable about his father, he decides to spend the day having fun with Orel. But very clearly, he's gonna be benefiting from this more than Orel. Because it doesn't get to the root of his problems, Orel's gonna continue to have these struggles with Clay. All the while, Stopframe is able to ignore his problems and go on with his life. Eventually, though, he does help Orel realize that the one good thing that Clay ever did was to make him. And this seems to be a turning point in Stopframe's life. He realizes that he can enjoy being around other people, and he puts his really unsettling and dangerous obsession with Clay to the side. Even when Clay finally breaks down and wants to be in a relationship with Stopframe, Stopframe turns him down, and it's implied that from here on out, he's seen the error of his ways and he's gonna make things right. Or at least, not be as bad of a person as he used to be. Do I think this justifies everything he's done?
Of course not.
In fact, I can use Stopframe's own words against him. In regards to this whole redemption,
It's too late.
yes, Stopframe has decided to stop trying to destroy Clay's life and claim him for himself. Yes, he's not going to be as bitter or mean of a person, and yes, he's established a friendship with Orel, but look at all the damage he's caused. He brought a troubled child into this world because he wanted to break up a marriage, and it basically worked. This made Clay and Bloberta's marriage way unhappier, and it also added a lot more stress to Orel's life. Though, of course, that last part wasn't intended, but does he care? Nope. He's also definitely not going to connect with Shapey, you know, his own son. He's not going to try to make things right with Bloberta or apologize for what he did to her. And then Clay, well, yeah, okay, I can see why he wouldn't want to make things right with him, so moving on. It's too little too late. No matter what he does to apologize or to try to make them happy now, it won't undo the last 7 years where he spread nothing but misery. And how do I know he's not going to try to make things right? Does that really seem like something he'd do? Even after he's had that heart-to-heart with Orel, it's pretty clear that all he really wants to do is just move on. Stopframe here goes to show that it's not the religion that makes Moralton bad. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's something in the water, but everyone here is just evil, regardless of their beliefs. The scary thing is that, just like a lot of the people in Moralton, there are people like Stopframe in real life. These sad, deranged people that'll latch onto a person even if they don't really know them. They'll kind of construct an alternate version of the person in their head, kind of like an ideal form, so to speak. And then they'll do anything they can to sink that hook into the person and never let them go. Even if it means destroying their family, friendships, or their life in general, as long as they can have the person, they'll be happy. And really, at the end of the day, that's what matters. Who cares what people think about them? As long as they get what they want, they win. It's hard to give sympathy to people like these, especially when they're like Stopframe, who, when you think about it, have caused basically all of the major problems in the course of the show. With the exception of the beginning of Clay and Bloberta's marriage, Stopframe is responsible for basically anything that causes the show to be what it is. At least with the Puppingtons. That's why I like to call Coach Stopframe the man in the shadows. He may not get a ton of focus, but when you look at everything all laid out, he's like a shadowy puppet master who's been playing with the characters to cause all these problems, and they just don't go away. Unseen and immoral, selfish and possessive, cold and distant. All of these things make up Danielle Stopframe, the man in the shadows. Oh man, I can hear the comments already.
How come you're making a principal Fakey video when you haven't even made a Censordoll video? That's one of your most requested things ever! How dare you!
Alright, relax everybody. There's a perfectly good explanation for this. For one, the Censordoll video is in the works, but it's just taking a little while longer than I thought. And two, I'm of the very rare opinion that Principal Fakey is a lot more interesting than people give him credit for. Yeah, sure, he only gets one episode to himself, and he's not as layered as, say, Clay, Bloberta, or Reverend Putty. But as a member of the Christian faith, I can firmly say that Principal Fakey needs a lot more attention. Why? Well, let me explain. I've always said that Moral Orel isn't a show that's based around making fun of Christianity. It's about exploring the bad Christians who help make Christianity look bad, and Fakey is one of the biggest examples. First of all, there's the obvious aspect of him being the principal of Diorama Elementary, and he doesn't really care about his job or his students. He's just there to take a paycheck, and that's about it. He's not interested in qualified teachers, just ones that work for cheap. And when he does do something nice for his students, he wants something in return. For example, in the episode Love, where he buys a new playground for the students, he expects them to lavish him with all this extravagant praise and thanks. But no, they're too busy spending time looking at a dog. So naturally, this can't be allowed to continue. Or the episode Prayer, where if Orel wins the prayer bee, Diorama Elementary will be celebrated for its spirituality. Not like spirituality really matters to Principal Fakey, but imagine just how much his life would change if he had the label of Principal of the most religious school in America. I mean, it probably wouldn't really do that much for him, but in a town like Moralton, it wouldn't hurt, so why not pursue it? It's a story that's seen time and time again, inside and outside of the church. If someone gets a little bit of power, they'll stretch it as far as it can go, whether it's to impose their beliefs on other people, or for an undeserved ego boost. It's still an unfortunate part of human nature. But that's not the only negative aspect of humanity that Principal Fakey indulges in. He also can't accept responsibility for his actions. There's a whole episode about it called Repression, and personally, it's one of my favorites in Season 2. He's married to Millie Fakey, and he doesn't really care all that much about her. The one he really cares about is Nurse Bendy, but he doesn't care about her on any emotional or spiritual level. It's all physical, and even then, it's only physical for him. Fakey's having all the fun. Meanwhile, Bendy zones out, or just goes about her day. You could argue that him thinking that Nurse Bendy is head over heels for him just like how he is head over heels for her could tie into his ego, but I don't know, it could just as easily be him being an idiot, which he kind of is. What's the point I'm trying to make in all this? Well, Fakey loves to spend quality time with Nurse Bendy until he, again, fires the load. The very second he's finished, he's very remorseful for what he's done. He goes from, oh yeah, to, woe is me, I'm a terrible person, how can I live with myself? And then he starts to care about his wife back home. But by then it's already too late. He's committed a sin. So what does he do about it?
Nothing.
Nothing at all. In fact, the one time he does have a moment of clarity and goes to seek some help from Reverend Putty, who turns out to be no help whatsoever, he ends up coming across Orel, who tells him to repress his feelings because, as we all know, he's an authority figure. He can't do anything wrong. So Fakey continues to do what he's always been doing and burying his feelings and continuing to live in sin. But then he takes it a step further by throwing his wife out and getting more aggressive with Nurse Bendy. Even after her tragic incident in Alone and her finding some happiness with her son Joe, he keeps going after her regardless of how she feels. And I'm sure the cycle keeps repeating. He goes after her, he has sex with her, he feels terrible, and then it repeats. In a town as religious as Moralton that's supposed to understand the works of God better than anyone else, it's amazing that Fakey will not change what he's doing. See, one of the most important parts about being forgiven by God is that you repent. It's like what Jesus said all the time when he would forgive sinners, "Go and sin no more." God cannot be fooled. He knows your heart. So no matter how many times Fakey will scream to the heavens, "Oh, I feel terrible, I'm a sinner, forgive me," God knows it's not legit. Now there's a big difference between addiction and choice. If you asked Fakey, and of course he would have to be real for you to ask him, he would say that he's addicted to Nurse Bendy and he can't get enough of her body. Like physically cannot get enough. But that's not true. He's making the continuous choice to go after her and betray his marriage vows, and put Nurse Bendy in many uncomfortable and unwanted situations. So the fact that this is all a choice, that he is going out of his way to do something wrong, and that he knows is wrong, and does nothing about it, speaks volumes to where his heart truly is. To any outsider, a town like Moralton seems to be led by the most austere, devout Christians ever, but that's not the case. Christians are not immune from sin, nor are they immune from making bad choices, but if they really cared about what they've done, and if they really cared about what their Heavenly Father tells them to do, then they would try and break the cycle, even if it is an addiction. But as we've said, this is not an addiction, this is straight up 100% deliberately choosing to do the wrong thing. Now this is where we can tie Fakey's ego back into things. Fakey considers himself to be above everyone else. We already knew that. We've established that he's an egomaniac and he abuses his power, but he also considers himself above God. The desires of the flesh, to him, are more important than the needs of the soul. He believes in God, he goes through the motions at church, and he presents himself as a leading religious figure in the community, but his heart doesn't match. And he's too stuck in his ways to ever change. He takes rules for thee, not for me, to a whole other level. Which, even if it is on a smaller scale, is something that happens a lot in the Christian community. Sometimes a sin can be too comfortable or too familiar to get rid of, so they keep it a part of their everyday lives. And to be clear, this isn't always something as major as infidelity. It can be smaller things like lying or unrighteous anger or egotism, but the point still stands. It's the embodiment of that old Mr. Enter quote. You know the one. What I'm doing is wrong, I know that it's wrong, but I'm going to do it anyway. This is especially prevalent in religious leaders who would rather present the image of being a religious leader rather than actually helping people find salvation through God. More often than not, these people are stuck up their own butts and would rather look at the speck in their neighbor's eye rather than address the plank in their own. These people, more often than not, will claim that they're doing this for the non-believers. They need to present that image for their sake. After all, who would trust a sinful pastor, right? Well, first of all, some of the best pastors came from sinful backgrounds. And second, that's not true. Because if you present the holier-than-thou image, you're only going to alienate people and thereby hurt your faith, not strengthen it. And let's be real, that's not something that Fakey cares about. It's all about making himself look good for his own self-worth. Everything is about himself. He won't spend money on the kids because he wants it for himself. He won't take Nurse Bendy's lack of interest or consent into account when he, does things with her. It's all about what he wants. So he'll make believe and pretends that she's interested. That way, it's not him sinning, it's them sinning together. And then the big one. When it comes time to take accountability for his actions, he blames his wife. Within the context of the episode, it shows that he has blocked all the stuff he's doing with Nurse Bendy out of his memory, but he did this to spare himself. If you ask me, Fakey is the embodiment of Moralton's hypocrisy. It's all about the surface level and not what's deep inside. Meanwhile, Christianity is supposed to be the other way around. It doesn't matter how other people perceive you. All that matters is how God sees you, and he doesn't look on the outside. He looks on the inside, but these people don't care. They will gladly commit whatever sin they'd like, they can damage the reputation of their religion, that's all fine. But if somebody else does it, then that's a big problem. And in order to be accepted socially, you must conform to their very rigid and impossible standards. So many people in Moralton take the Fakey road of ignoring their sin and pursuing it further, helping it develop and grow stronger. But to me, Fakey embodies this the best. See, Clay has the added aspect of having all these different layers of childhood trauma and narcissism and his family dynamic that he doesn't want to be involved in. While Censordoll is a pure evil villain with plans of town domination, and possibly even some voodoo magic. But Fakey, on the other hand, is a pretty realistic representation of what the show is trying to convey. It's folks like Fakey that help drive Moralton down a bad path. But so long as he's not being inconvenienced, that's just fine. Let me tell you, it's a good thing that Moralton has folks like Orel who are ready to take over once they get older and help steer the town in a good direction, because otherwise, this town is going to crumble. And it won't take all that long to do it. Before we get to our Patreon stuff, it's time for another fan art shoutout, and this one comes to us from Lady Sega Genesis. I was having a pretty bad day when I saw this one, and it cheered me right up. First of all, I love anything that can make me laugh, and this has so many in-jokes in it that I don't even know where to begin. First of all, it's got Lou from Mike Lewinog, which has been a long-standing punching bag on this channel, mostly because of my very weird relationship with it. It's kind of a roller coaster if you're new to the channel. And then there's also me as the enemy sales guy from Kirby Right Back At Ya. Many have said that I kind of look like him a little, and also some in my personal work life say that I have that salesman's tone, whatever that means, so thank you very much, Lady Sega Genesis. Again, I really appreciate it, and it means a lot that you took some time to make this. Well, folks, thanks for watching the video. What'd you guys think? What do you think is the worst thing that Fakey has done, and do you agree with my analysis that he's practically Moralton personified? Comment below and let me know, because I'm always excited to hear what you guys have to say. And now it's time to thank our wonderful Patreon people, starting with our Masters of Fate. Chan 11, Drew the Stew, Kev Messick, Manny Paredes, MD the Dude, Ryan Williams, and Woody Woo. And now our executive producers, Aaron Vasquez, Albert Robinson, Blackjack, H.R. Hoffman, Indiscreet One, Ravioli Supremo, Unkale, and who else but Zane. If you too would like your name read at the end of every Media Mementos video, then why not donate to the Patreon? We've got a link in the description below for you to check out. Down there, we've also got a link to the Media Mementos Discord server. Why not pop in and say hello? Why not pop in and say hi? Well, it's about time we got here. Way back when I made Clay Puppington the Monster of Moralton, many people in the comments told me, yeah, Clay's pretty bad, but he is nothing compared to Miss Censordoll. And yeah, I agree. While not the main antagonist of the series, at least not exactly, more on that at the end, but Miss Censordoll is a truly vile, hateful, disgusting person, and I love her for it. So let's dig into Miss Censordoll, the devil's favorite Christian. Before I explain what that title means, let me give you a brief overview of who Miss Censordoll is. She's the Moralton librarian, and normally that wouldn't mean that she's in a position of power, but she uses her naturally commanding presence and intimidating figure to get what she wants. Censordoll is a master manipulator. She has this uncanny ability to get into people's heads and discover their desires, hopes, fears, and dreams. Using those, She uses people as pawns in her wicked scheme to gain power. That's her entire quest in life, is to get more power than anybody else. She pretends to be a pious Christian just like everybody else in the town, but Censordoll takes it a step further. Not only is she like Clay and Fakey in the sense that she's a rules for thee, not for me sort of person, but she does something that nobody else in the town seems to do. She weaponizes everybody's faith. Now, maybe it's my personal interpretation given the fact that I'm a proud Christian and always have been, but to me, I don't think Miss Censordoll believes in God whatsoever. I think it's all a front. Remember what I said in the Stephanie video? Whenever Moralton's beliefs are challenged, or whenever they find something that they don't like, they will do whatever they can to either fix the problem or dispose of it. So it's natural that Censordoll would want to pretend to be like the townspeople in order to gain influence. But as a result, she relies on everybody's ignorance regarding the Word of God and is able to use it to her own advantage. What do I mean by this? Well, one of Miss Censordoll's favorite pastimes, has been for years, is organizing protests against anything, really. You've heard of Rule 34, well now here's Rule 35. If it exists, and it's not an egg or egg-based, Miss Censordoll is going to pretend to be offended by it, and when she pretends to be offended, she whips her followers into a frenzy, convincing her that X thing here is now the most evil threat to the culture of Christian society, even though it's not. The reasons she has for being offended are obviously going to come across as jokes to us, the audience, but in universe, she's taking advantage of the people's stupidity in order to exercise control. See, when she was a kid, her mother removed her reproductive organs against her will, and this created some kind of power imbalance in her head, and ever since, she's wanted to remain the dominant force of her society. And in this case, it just so happens to be Moralton, a community of gullible and poorly read individuals who think they're following the Word of God, but in actuality probably get all their information from the Minecraft Bible or the Word on the Street Bible, so they don't exactly know what they're doing, and that's where Censordoll comes in. In her own mind, she is God. She is the all-knowing, all-powerful figure who can determine what's right and wrong. Protesting is stage 1. Stage 2 is gaining some level of power. When it comes time for Clay to seek re-election for his stinking dead-end job, which just so happens to be Moralton's mayorship, Miss Censordoll decides to strike while the iron is hot. Clay and Orel had gone through a traumatic camping event recently, so in Censordoll's eyes, Clay is vulnerable. Unlike a Christ-like figure who would, tend to the sick, help them work through their problems, or just generally not take advantage of somebody's moment of weakness, Censordoll decides that this is finally time to take over Moralton once and for all. Naturally, Clay puts up a fight, and Censordoll looks like she's about to take Clay down, but no. Instead of taking the easy way out, instead, Censordoll decides to have Clay continue to be mayor, but in name only. She decides to go the George Wallace route and have a surrogate in her place, and manipulate him in order to get her agenda across. And if you're wondering why she's doing it this way and not actually being the godlike figure herself, well, in this sense, she knows she's got Clay in her grasp. She knows about his trauma and his Oedipus complex, and won't hesitate to use it to her advantage. It's a small gain, sure, but whatever helps her feel better than everybody else, she'll take it. And we know that Clay's gonna stay in line as well, because if you don't do what Censordoll says, the threat of protesting will be unleashed onto you at full force. Censordoll will use this card several times throughout the series, and everybody's clearly afraid because they know exactly what's coming. So, how does this relate back to the title? Why is she the devil's favorite Christian, quote-unquote? Well, I'm sure you're assuming, it's because she does bad things. Obviously, the devil loves when you do bad things, and yes, that's kind of true, though there's a lot more to the story. In order to explain what exactly is wrong with Censordoll's ideology, we're going to have to connect her to a wonderful, lovely, not at all psychotic organization in Kansas, the Westboro Baptist Church. And to all my non-religious viewers out there who shuddered at the name, don't worry, we Christians are right there with you, and in fact, I'd even say we hate them more than you do. Because it's people like these that give us a bad name. Instead of going by the word of God, they have their own teachings and traditions that contradict the Bible, and they're so loud and so angry that they get so much media attention and exposure, and it ruins the reputation of real Christians that are trying to make a difference. And it's not just the Westboro Baptist Church either. There's also those nut jobs who say you're going to hell if you don't believe what I believe, or who resort to throwing fits in the middle of a debate. Simply put, they're doing it wrong. Let me ask you out there, ignoring things like religion or politics for a second, what sort of argument is going to endear you more to an ideology or group? Someone who is understanding, listens to what you have to say, has well thought out but also constructive and peaceful rebuttals? Or someone who screams, calls you names, and say that you should die? In the Christian community, for some reason, there's a vocal minority who would say the latter. The psychology behind this is, at least for these people, they're trying to warn you of what's to come. But again, that anger and vitriol, that's not going to convince anybody and, in fact, is just going to scare them away from Christ. Censordoll is the exact same way. Do you think these protests, her control over people, her nasty demeanor, or her breaking the very laws that she helped set up, do they either enrich people's lives or help spread the word of God? No. They spread the word of Censordoll. And if she was a Christian, she'd know that, for one, you're not supposed to do that because that is a grievous sin. And two, if she's a Christian, she would believe in the Bible. And the Bible has several accounts of people doing this exact same thing, trying to usurp the power of God and make themselves a godlike figure here on Earth, and it never really goes well for them. Just ask Nebuchadnezzar how that fiery furnace thing went, and you'll see what I mean. But wait, I hear you all screaming. In Before Orel, she was throwing a fit that Clay hadn't told Orel about God. So clearly she cares about evangelizing to the people. Nope. As I've said before, she uses Christianity as a way to control others. So the fact that one person in Moralton, even if it's someone who's too young to understand the world around him, doesn't believe everything she believes, or at least that she pretends to believe, then there's going to be a real problem because they might grow up into being a free thinker. Luckily for Censordoll, that didn't really happen, and in fact she decided to manipulate Orel to being her successor. But I think with that little bit of context there, I think you can understand how this whole "you're not like us so you must be shunned" thing got started. Remember, Censordoll uses fear, manipulation, and intimidation in order to influence the way Moralton operates. Even legitimate leaders like Clay or Reverend Putty have no real power to stop her. So, in the same way that she's able to get people angry at things like the Wizard of Oz, she'll be able to rely on that natural us versus them mentality that some misguided Christians seem to have, and take it to the extreme. And all this just makes me wish that much more that we got the full Censordoll arc in the show. Yeah, much like Shapey and Block, Miss Censordoll's entire tale wasn't completed, and in fact, unlike Shapey and Block, there's no implied ending to her arc either. The last we see of her, she's still got a firm grip on Clay, and then she's never seen again. In a sense, she won. Because Moral Orel proper doesn't have a final ending for Miss Censordoll, it's implied that she controlled Clay throughout his tenure, she lived out the rest of her years as an angry, bitter woman, and then died. That's it. Had the show gone on, she would have taken over Moralton as some kind of dark dictator, and then presumably at the end, would have finally gotten what's coming to her, and everyone would have seen what an evil person she was, and hey, maybe some of the effects on the town would have gotten reversed. We may never know, sadly, so I guess we just gotta go with what we got. And what we got is a really dark, messed up woman. One who considers herself above the god she pretends to worship. And in doing so, is actually doing the devil's work instead. By making Christianity look bad, and by making people suffer under a supposedly godly leader, it sends a message to the world that God isn't worth your time. If only the people of Moralton knew, then they could finally get rid of her once and for all. But unfortunately, Censordoll knows her people all too well. She lives in their head and will never ever leave. And that is the story of Miss Censordoll, the devil's favorite Christian? Well folks, thanks for watching the video. What'd you guys think? What do you think is the worst thing that Censordoll has ever done? And what did you think of my analysis here in comparison to some less than desirable individuals and groups? Comment below and let me know, because I'm always excited to hear what you guys have to say. And now it's time to thank our wonderful Patreon people, starting with our Masters of Fate. Chan 11, Drew the Stew, Kev Messick, Platinum Bass, Quiet Chap, Ryan Williams, Timey and Woody Woo. And now our executive producers, Albert Robinson, Blackjack, H.R. Hoffman, Indiscreet One, Leaf Storm, Orsinus, Ravioli Supremo, Unkale, and who else but Zane. If you two would like your name read at the end of every Media Mementos video, then please consider donating to the Patreon. There's a link in the description below for you to check out. Also, there's a link to the channel's Discord server, so stop on by and say hello. Thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you guys next time. With my track record of being such a big Orel fan, I bet I'm the last person you thought would say this. Orel isn't perfect. I know, I'm just as surprised as you. Surprisingly, it just didn't have a spotless track record. It did in the 3rd season. Every episode there is absolutely fantastic. But for once I wanted to shake things up and see what the weakest part of Orel was. Which, by the way, as it turns out, would round about to be a positive outlook on the entire series. How is that possible? Well, I'll explain shortly, but for now, I want to get into the introduction. I wanted to find the worst episode of Orel, so I went onto Reddit, as I rarely do, and went on to r/Moralorel, one of the very few subreddits I'm actually active on, and if you ever see a post from me asking for people's opinions, chances are it's me trying to get some information for an upcoming video, wink wink. And that's what I did for this one. I asked the people on r/Moralorel, what is your least favorite episode in the entire show? And more than any episode out there, the one I got the most was God's Chef, episode 2 from season 1. Already I could tell that this is probably a valid opinion. Season 1 is by far the weakest season of the show. It's not as dark, not as thought-provoking, not as character-focused, it's more just kind of a repetitive adult comedy. It's not bad. Far from it. It's just compared to seasons 2 and 3, it gets blown right out of the water. Although, it is a very important season. I'm not going to discuss it here today, but one of the videos we're going to have on Media Mementos is discussing why Orel Season 1, despite not really fitting with the rest of the show, is crucial with your experience to the entire series. But again, that's a topic for another day, so now let's get into why God's Chef is apparently the worst episode of Orel. First off, what's the episode about? Orel is masturbating, and already that's not a great start. I don't really see Orel as the kind of guy who'd want to do that, and it also seems like he knows it's wrong. Except when he doesn't. When he's talking to Reverend Putty, it seems like he doesn't know that the church thinks that masturbation is a sin. However, when he's talking to the janitor, it seems like he does know that, so I don't really know. Anyways, Orel is taught that masturbation is a waste of his seed. This is making me feel uncomfortable because it's talking about a child. This is not okay. I guess I have to press on anyways for the sake of the review. Anyways, Orel realizes that if he wants to keep doing, that, he actually has to get people pregnant. So he breaks into people's houses and gets women pregnant with his, You can see why a lot of people don't like this one, right? For me, I don't find it disturbing or gross. Well, okay, I do a little bit. It's more bad when I'm actually talking about it, especially to people that I'm sure haven't seen the show yet. But really, this episode's just kinda dull. You kinda get the whole joke from the very start of when Orel has his plan. Other than that, it's just the same thing over and over. Orel's getting these women pregnant and everyone's going, huh, I wonder how that's happening. And then he gets caught, and then Clay scolds him, and it plays out like a traditional Moral Orel Season 1 episode, all the beats included. It's just a little more off-color and disgusting. A lot of people say that it doesn't really fit with the overall theme of the show, and yeah, I kinda get that. Once again, Orel doesn't really act super in character here, though. I am more willing to cut them some slack because it's episode 2. In a lot of shows, they haven't quite set the character boundaries yet, so they don't really know where everyone's gonna be in terms of their overall structure. We've seen this in Moral Orel quite well. Clay started off as the tough but dependable dad with a bit of surliness and distance to him, but then he turned into this. Even so, it doesn't feel like a premise that the show would usually use. And don't forget, this is the same show that has its very first episode being the dead coming back to life, and the main issue is that they're not clothed. And then later on, we have a Jewish doctor who gets injured in a bus accident, getting a wound that looks exactly like the face of Orel's Jesus sculpture, and everyone thinks it's some kind of holy visage. In fact, that's the name of the episode. So why doesn't God's Chef work? Well, as one user put it, I get that it's only the second episode ever made, but like every character in that episode is so out of character. It really just seems more like a homemade parody episode than an actual episode. Honestly, yeah, that's kinda right. It's the characterization and tone. Let's look at the very next episode, Charity, for some comparison. This episode has Orel getting addicted to crack. He acts very out of character in the second half of the episode, but that's because he's addicted to crack and is desperate to get his fix. In the first half of the episode, he's smoking crack because he thinks he's doing a good thing. If he just gives money to people, it's all a waste. But if he's buying something from somebody, then it's a good thing, and everyone wins as long as he uses what he bought. This is Orel being naive. This is Orel being way too trusting of what his dad says. In this one, it's just Orel kind of being selfish. It's, well, I want to do this thing, and the only way I can do this thing is by doing something I know is wrong, so I'm just gonna go ahead and do it. This is also an episode that doesn't have a lot of substance. The only joke here is that Orel is doing this disgusting thing. It's falling into that adult cartoon trap we've discussed time and time again where it thinks that being shocking and disturbing is funny all on its own. It's really not, but luckily, Orel grew out of this really quickly. This is the second episode, and right after this, for the most part, they get it right every time. If they have something shocking and disturbing, they have a joke that goes alongside it, or hey, maybe even they have a message. But with that being said, do I think that God's Chef is the worst episode of the show? No. I actually think it's the second worst. There's one that falls just a little bit shorter than this. And funny enough, it's not in the first season, it's in the second. Also funny enough, this is the episode I got the second most amount of times on that Reddit post, Geniuses. It's not Genesis, it's Geniuses. For those who don't remember this episode, I don't blame you. It's the one where Orel finds a frozen caveman and everyone defrosts him and has him become this radio Bible guy. It's not very good. For one, this episode feels the most vindictive out of all of Moral Orel. Even though I'm a religious person myself, I can definitely take the jokes as long as the other people in the world are able to take jokes about their beliefs. It's only fair after all. And it's no secret to me that the people behind Moral Orel, at least most of them, aren't particularly religious. They have a lot of problems with the religious community and, you know, I can kind of understand. But one of the key selling points about Moral Orel is it's not a show making fun of religion, it's a show making fun of the bad parts of religion, specifically the bad people who follow it, the ones who do terrible things and use their faith as a guise to make it seem okay. This one kind of does away with that and goes straight for the sacred cow. Again, I'm not offended, I'm more looking at this thinking this doesn't really fit. It's also not particularly funny, and the story feels kinda rushed, and I think it's a very big missed opportunity. This is around the time when Moral Orel was starting to discuss some more serious topics. One of them raised in this episode is the fact that, even in the face of overt, undeniable proof, people will still jump through hurdles and go through all these long stretches of thought to prove that they're still right. By nature, human beings don't want to admit that we're wrong, whether it be about something serious like religion or politics, or even in small things like petty arguments with your friends and neighbors. And we can see here that the residents of Moralton go kinda nuts when they're proven wrong, and will do anything they can to hang on to the belief that they are right. I wish the episode would have been more about that, rather than just being, oh, it's the ape-man story that we've seen in things like South Park, or Billy and Mandy, or all these other shows. The only part of this one I really liked is the bake sale scene for one particular reason. It shows that it's not just Clay and Bloberta that confuse Shapey and Block, it's Reverend Putty as well. So maybe it really is just Orel and Christina in this entire town that can tell the two apart. So I guess that's 1 point in favor for Clay and Bloberta. They're still awful parents, don't get me wrong, but that's 1 point out of 10,000. There's also one more episode I feel like I should bring up, and that's Holy Visage. We talked about that very briefly early on here, and we'll talk more in depth about it later on when it gets its own review. Yes, we're gonna do each episode of Moral Oral, so yay, that's something to look forward to. But a lot of people will point to this review and say, wait a minute, this is all wrong. Holy Visage is the worst episode because it has the worst IMDb rating. First of all, that doesn't usually mean that that's the worst episode of something. Let's use SpongeBob SquarePants for an example. The worst episodes there are Squid Baby, License to Milkshake, Dear Vikings, and Ditchin'. Now, those episodes are all bad, but they are not the worst episodes of SpongeBob SquarePants. If you ask a bunch of fans, it'd either be The Splinter, House Fancy, Little Yellow Book, or so many others. It's kind of the same with Moral Oral too. Holy Visage may have the worst IMDb rating, but that doesn't mean it's the worst episode. In my personal experience, it seems like there are a lot of people that hate it, and there are a lot of people that like it a moderate amount. I haven't met anybody that loves it, so that probably explains the IMDb score. Those who like it an average amount, and those who don't like it really don't like it. That's why this video is about God's Chef. Not a lot of people are crazy about it. It seems like people can hate it just about as much as Holy Visage, but not as many people are excited about it. I'd go on, but that's kind of the whole point of the video you just watched. I'm also going to be looking in the comments to see if anybody tries to actually us with that argument, just in case they haven't seen the video. That happens sometimes and it's kind of funny. I don't hold anything against anybody, it's just, you know, you get kind of passionate about something and you feel the need to write it down, but then you go on to watch the rest of the video and whoops, the argument I used is there. Uh-oh. I think it's happened to all of us at least once, so no shame. It's just funny, but I'm getting off topic here. I better wrap this up. So is God's Chef the worst episode of Moral Oral? No, but it's close. I'd still say this is one of the only 2 episodes of the show that I straight up don't like. There are other episodes that I think are meh, but they're not bad, you know? These 2, Geniuses and God's Chef, are the only ones I can definitely call missteps. But they're not that bad. I'd give them about a 4 out of 10, and if that's the worst that Moral Oral can get, then that speaks volumes to how good the show is. It keeps a pretty good sense of quality even when it dips. You never watch it and go, well, that was pointless. It's just a weaker offering, and you know that in the very next episode, they're gonna turn it around and make it so much better. Especially later on down the road, because I've said time and time again, Season 3 is truly something beautiful. So God's Chef may not be the worst, but it's one of them, so good job, Reddit, you helped me make a video. Well, folks, thanks for watching the video. What'd you guys think? What's your favorite and least favorite episode of the show? Comment below and let me know, because I'm always excited to hear what you guys have to say. Real quick, I'd like to thank our Patreon executive producers, Reziel, Leaf Razor, Azarius, Whoopdoo, Michaela Bellamy, MD the Dude, and Blackjack. If you too would like your name read at the end of every Media Mementos video, then consider donating to our Patreon, which has a link in the description below. Okay, it's time for Comment of the Day. And today's Comment of the Day goes to Stephen A. Douglas. Here's what Steven has to say. Shrek 4 commits the cardinal sin of movies, being so forgettable that you remember almost nothing from it a few hours later. All I remember to this day is the surface level drama you highlighted in the video, but it's the same stuff that you'd find in a Saturday morning cartoon with the same premise. The only reason it's perceived to be deeper than it is because of the runtime. Unlike a Saturday morning cartoon, which is usually 20 minutes or so, this movie is over an hour. So things are stretched out. It doesn't go deeper, it just goes wider, if you know what I mean. I most certainly do, and I couldn't agree more. I'd like to say more, but honestly, that's kind of what the video's for. I know I barely had any speaking roles in it, but I absolutely agree with everything Billy said. Honestly, I don't know which one I prefer, Shrek the Third or Shrek Forever After. They're both bad, but in different ways. And I haven't seen Shrek the Third in a long time, so I don't know if they're equally bad, but I'll let you know as soon as I do. But I will always think that the first two are just perfect, you know? Anyways, thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll see you guys next time! In the last Moral Oral video we did, I said we were gonna cover the best Christmas ever, and hey, wouldn't you know it, we're actually gonna do it! Crazy, right? But in all seriousness, it's time to cover Moral Oral's episode, The Best Christmas Ever, or as I call it, the best episode in Season 1. If you don't remember the last Moral Oral video, or in case you haven't watched it, well, it's this one. Go ahead and check it out. It's gonna add a lot more context that you might need for this video, you know? But if you don't want to, or if you've already seen it, okay, let's continue. I said that unlike the rest of the first season, there was actually enough to cover here in an entire video all on its own. And here we go. It's time to talk about The Best Christmas Ever, the episode that, in my eyes, was the real turning point for Moral Oral. Before we begin, I can tell that a lot of people are gonna be typing, "Don't you mean nature? Isn't that the turning point for the show?" Yes and no. Yes, it's where the tone of the show shifted, but it's only when it shifted and committed to it. It's not the first time that Moral Oral became dark and serious. That was The Best Christmas Ever. This is the first time that the show's viewers went, "What?" And that's partially because this episode was aired first. This was not a great idea, but I've already discussed that in the last video, so I'm not going to waste any time here. So what's The Best Christmas Ever about? Well, funny enough, it's about Oral's worst Christmas ever. Reverend Putty talks about how Jesus is gonna come back during the rapture and he's not gonna be as nice this time, and through a complicated series of events, Orel interprets this to mean that Shapey, his illegitimate little brother, is actually the second coming of Christ. Shapey is his usual self. He screams, he's loud, he tears things apart at a moment's notice because of his uncontrollable anger, and Orel thinks this is all part of the new plan. The rapture's here, everybody, and Shapey's gonna lead it. He's gonna lead his army of angelic forces to help save the world from the heathens. This causes Orel and Shapey to just kind of be nuisances to everybody, but then their antics stop. It's revealed that Clay and Bloberta are having some severe issues, on Christmas no less. And why is that? Well, Clay and Bloberta had a big fight on Christmas Eve about Bloberta's infidelity. It seems like Clay has finally put two and two together and realized, yeah, Bloberta wasn't faithful. Either that, or he was finally letting loose all of the things he's kept pent up inside him ever since Shapey was born. Like he said, he doesn't remember conceiving Shapey. Shapey looks absolutely nothing like him. It's clear that he's in no way, shape, or form Clay's kid. Bloberta is absolutely adamant that either this is not true or not a big deal. And it's clearly for no other reason than the fact that she knows she's been cornered and has no way to get out of it. One of the weird things about this episode, at least in comparison to the rest of the show, is that Clay is actually the one we feel bad for here. Clay is the sympathetic one while Bloberta is portrayed as the monster. This is why I and a lot of people say that Bloberta is no saint. She's, I guess, by default, the lesser bad of the two parents. There's a lot up to interpretation as to how present she actually is with Orel and Shapey. But still, there's moments like this that prove she's not fully innocent. She's done a lot of things wrong. Of course, there were other things she did later on down the line, but still, we're focusing on this right now. For the first time ever, we see just how done Bloberta is with this whole marriage with Clay. The only other real glimpse of this we saw was in Maturity. That's where she and Clay were having that fight over Clay not getting enough action and her still weaning Shapey despite him being 7 years old, by the way. And yes, this is one of the many things I point to for evidence of Clay being bisexual and not gay. But here, she goes through a whole lot of different stages. First, she's mad at Clay that he's accusing her. Again, she fully knows that she's guilty, but still, she's trying to save face. Like I mentioned in the Clay video, what they really care about is their reputation, their image. They want everything to seem like they're the happy, perfect nuclear Christian family, even though they're not. So with this coming in, it's definitely destroying all that. Also, it's destroying the security that she always wanted. Then her anger turns to rage when Clay asks that infamous question, "Who's been inside you?" After that, she just shuts down. There's this really powerful moment where we see all these different shots of Bloberta staring off into space or having her eyes wide open while she's laying in her bed. There's no music, there's no sound, there's no dialogue, and it's a really haunting moment. We know she did something wrong, but still, the emotions are just so raw. And this whole thing is juxtaposed by being in between two happy, silly, fun Orel and Shapey scenes. Real quick, that is one thing I really gotta commend this episode for. It's that it balances the humor and story really well. We have Clay and Bloberta, where obviously we're feeling a whole different mix of things, and depending on how you feel about these characters and where you stand on each side of the argument, you're gonna feel different things. So I just want to make it clear this is how I'm interpreting it, okay? We're square? Cool. But it also manages to be really funny. It has things like, if the Lord were alive today, what would you give him this Christmas day? Shapey freaking out about there being no presents. Orel saying the apocalypse has come and he and Shapey destroy a manger scene. And then at the end, more specifically the last 30 seconds, that's where the story and emotion finally takes over. This is Bloberta's final wave of emotion just being outright done. She's gone gray, numb. Not the episode numb, but something very similar, actually. I'll touch on this moment a little more towards the end, okay? Right now, we gotta get to my favorite character, Clay. So how does Clay feel about all this? Well, obviously very distressed. Who wouldn't feel bad about their wife cheating on them and fathering an illegitimate child trying to pass it off as yours? But since it's Clay, we know this is gonna hit a little bit more differently than the traditional marriage. Clay doesn't like Bloberta at all. In fact, he hates her. So why is he bothered by the fact that she cheated on him with someone else? Keep in mind, he doesn't know it's Stopframe yet, so he can't really process the entire thing because he doesn't know who the guy is. Still, there's that ever-present sense that he failed as a man, as he says in his speech in Sacrifice, which, by the way, I cannot wait to get to that episode. He says that his main goal is to have Bloberta, or to be a little bit more general, being a man is about having a wife and a family and to hang on to them, not for any sort of personal gain, but so that other people can't have them. To him, being a man is about getting a woman and hanging on to her and kind of seeing her as a little bit of a trophy. We could go on about whether or not this is like objectifying women or some kind of Moralton thing or a comment on traditional Christian values. I'm not going to go into that here. I'll leave that for you to discuss in the comments. But what I will say is that now we understand why Clay is so upset about this. Shapey's not his kid, and he's a constant, forever reminder that he failed. Whether or not everybody else sees it the same way as he does doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is that he sees it this way, and it's gonna keep fueling his anger, bitterness, and distance towards the rest of his family, even though Orel and Shapey and then later Block shouldn't be blamed for this. It doesn't matter. To him, this thing is beyond saving. It's over. It's time to fully check out and work on that stupid dead-end job that he hates. And the strange thing is, after the fight, Clay disappears for the rest of the episode. We don't see him again until season 2. And then he admits to Orel that he only reconciled with his wife because they want to keep up their appearances and make it look like, again, they're the typical happy family. So let's really look at that, okay? Clay hates Bloberta. Clay hates Shapey. Clay knows that he'll never be rid of the constant reminder that he was cheated on, but he decided to stay in that marriage because of his image. And for no other reason. It wasn't to make Orel happy or to make some kind of stable environment for the kids. No, it was all about him and what he could gain from it, sort of as, I don't know, a power move in the community or a way to compensate himself for being wronged. This could also tie into the fact that he's the mayor of Moralton. He wants to keep being re-elected and therefore needs to keep his image up to snuff. However, he doesn't like that job, so it's kind of debatable as to whether or not that's actually a reason. And throughout all of this, Orel and of course Shapey have no idea that their family's being destroyed. Shapey's too hyper and focused on Christmas in order to think about anything like that, and Orel's blinded by his belief that the Messiah has come early. But then Bloberta finds them in the street, and she tells them that she and Clay are gonna get a divorce. This manages to shake not only Orel, but Shapey as well. Right before we got this news, Shapey was tearing up the manger scene, but as soon as she said, we're getting a divorce, Shapey runs to Bloberta and hugs him, clearly distressed. I mean, look at that face. That is not a look of either joy or anger, which just so happened to be Shapey's only two emotions. Orel's destroyed by this too, and he prays to the heavens for something, anything to save his family. But then the episode fades out, leaving us on a cliffhanger. Of course, we know later that everything was okay, but we didn't at the time. If you view the episodes in the correct order, you'll just see this as, uh-oh, what's gonna happen? Or, man, that poor kid. He really has no idea what's going on, does he? This proved to not only the audience, but also the network, even if they didn't listen, that Moral Orel could do serious stuff really well. It's compelling, it's sad, and it's also pretty haunting at times too. But it also manages to be funny, thereby not alienating what Adult Swim wanted the show to be in the first place. Let's go to the ranking real quick. These are all the episodes we've reviewed up until this point. And so far, the best Christmas ever is at number 2. I don't expect it to stay there, but I do expect it to be in the top 5. It's a very solid episode that can honestly rival a lot of the season 3 greats. But enough about that. Next time for our Moral Orel video, we're going to be covering Rod Putty, and I've been looking forward to this one for a long time. We've done a lot of character quests about the Puppington family specifically, and don't worry, Orel is going to get his character quest, it's just going to take a little bit more time. But now, we get to cover someone who's not involved with that story at all. We're breaking new ground here, folks, so get ready. Next month is Rod Putty, but enough about that. Let's get on to the outro, shall we? Well, folks, thanks for watching the video. What'd you guys think? Generally speaking, who do you usually side with in this argument, Clay or Bloberta? Comment below and let us know because we're always excited to hear what you guys have to say. Real quick, I'd like to thank our Patreon executive producers, Leaf Razor, Azarius, Woopdoo, Michaela Bellamy, MD the Dude, Blackjack, and Nightingale Wednesday Nightmare. If you two would like your name read at the end of every Media Mementos video, then consider donating to our Patreon, which has a link in the description below. And now, folks, it's time for the comment of the day. Today's comment of the day comes from James Rowley. I like both ideas. Trevor's one feels like the original film's concept fully realized, whilst Billy's sounds like a great idea for an indie film. One thing I like about this video and any other How I Would Have Made It videos is that they show that any movie, regardless of the idea, can work if fleshed out. That's actually what we wanted to do. I mean, originally the Lorax one was just kind of, I hate this movie and this is what I always wanted it to be because it was really disappointing. And then of course, Lazy Town was just kind of its own thing. But all the other ideas that you guys haven't seen yet, yeah, that's basically what we want to do with How I Would Have Made It. All these different things that had a lot of missed potential. They didn't have to be as bad as they are, but here we are. So it's up to us to take matters into our own hands, but for more information on that, just stay tuned, okay? Anyways, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time! Before this video starts, we have yet another art shout out to make. I always love these, not just because I like interacting with the community, but hey, I like seeing all the cool art. A lot of our fans have some really amazing art styles, and hey, so does our editor, Billy HL. And yes, Billy, you can put some of your art on the screen, in fact I'd encourage it, but sadly you're not the subject of today's shout out. Instead it goes to the wonderful Higby Productions, who made this. Very good job, Higby. I actually really like this one a lot. Not that I don't like the other art stuff, of course, I love them all. But this is definitely going on to my little wall of art I made. For those of you who don't know, every little piece of fan art that comes in from Media Mementos, yeah, I print it out and put it in a little bit of a wall, which I'm probably going to turn into a book. You know, just in case I'm having a rough day and I need to be reminded that, you know, there's some people out there that really like what we do, and who care enough to take their time to make something like this. Not only that, but to use their creative talent that all these people seem to have a whole lot of, and chose to draw me or Billy or both. Out of all things. It really does mean a lot. And now back to our regularly scheduled Moral Orel video. Unless I keep stalling, which I won't, so yeah, have fun! We're back again talking about more Moral Orel. And last time, at least last time in terms of talking about episodes, we left off with the best Christmas ever. Even though that didn't come around Christmas time, but you know what? Who cares? The video's still gonna be around by then. I hope, unless YouTube decides to do something really stupid with its copyright, like it always does. But that's pessimism there, we don't need that. Regardless of what YouTube's doing these days, we're gonna press on and talk about the Moral Orel Season 2 premiere, God's God's Image, or as I like to call it, Moral Oral Season 1 Perfected. Now, I liked Season 1. I thought it was good, it was funny, and it had some good character moments leading up to what we're gonna get in Seasons 2 and 3. Even so, I do consider it to be the weakest of the 3 seasons, but mostly because of one thing. The formula. Every episode, save for maybe 1 or 2, tended to have the same exact outline. Oral sees or hears something and gets confused, listens to somebody talk about that thing, misconstrues what they say, goes too far in it, and ends up getting punished by Clay. Granted, by this point, the show wasn't mostly about story. At the same time, though, it did feel pretty repetitive, even if it was interesting and funny. God's Image, though, decides to take that formula and make some substantial changes. Just like in The Best Christmas Ever, Oral is not the main focus. And in fact, it's not Clay or Bloberta this time either. It's kind of everybody. So what's this episode about? Well, first off, in this episode, we find out that most of the adults in Moralton aren't exactly fans of racial integration. Yeah, they're, let's just say they're probably fans of George Wallace. And I don't mean this guy, I mean this guy. Orel, not exactly hating people of a different race, just not really understanding them, believes that people of color need to be separated because, well, 1, his parents said so, and 2, in Reverend Putty's most recent sermon, he claimed that white people were the ones that looked most like Jesus, and therefore had the strongest resemblance to God's image. As a result, the Figurellis, the one black family in Moralton, are now segregated, but they don't have a problem with it. In fact, they constantly say their catchphrase, "No prob," and they mean it. And honestly, I don't know why they would have a prob with it, because this is actually kind of nice. In segregating the Figurellis from the rest of Moralton, their lives actually become better. They no longer have to ride the crowded parts of the school bus, they get their own drinking fountains, they don't have to be stuck in this overcrowded pool and instead get a nice hose bath, which, by the way, that scene, hilarious, gets me every time. Do the adults of Moralton like this now that the Figurellis are pretty much out of the picture? Nope. They don't like it because the Figurellis have it better than they do. And the kids want to be like the Figurellis, and it's just so horrible. To the characters, of course. I think this goes without saying, but these aren't my views. These are the views of the characters, so yeah, stop typing. Like Clay says at the end of the episode, Orel's big mistake was making things inconvenient for the racists, not the people that they hate, and it all spirals out of control, causing the Figurellis to leave town and Orel getting a spanking from the entire congregation. On paper, this sounds a lot like the traditional moral oral formula, but it really takes things in a new direction. Instead of Orel being an innocent kid who misunderstands everything that people says, God's Image is about Orel misunderstanding something, then just kinda going along with whatever the adults do. That doesn't stop them from blaming Orel in the first place, though, just because it was kind of his idea. Like, he started with the initial blueprint, but then the town went way too far with it. And of course, it's always Orel's fault. That's something you're gonna notice coming up, especially in that musical episode. Yeah, we're gonna talk about that more there, but for now, I gotta say that I'm really happy they decided to take some risks. Sticking to the formula would get really tiring, and as much as I like season 1, I don't think I would've liked 3 more seasons of it, so good job, guys! And because it's not strictly focused on Orel, we get to see a lot more of the townsfolk, like Clay and Bloberta, of course, but also Miss Censordoll, Reverend Putty, Coach Stopframe, and the guests of honor themselves, the Figurellis. This is important for 2 reasons. The first being that Orel is fine and all, but he can't carry the show by himself. We need a colorful cast of side characters to help keep things fresh. And the other important reason is that, as time would go on, Moral Orel would be less about, well, Moral Orel, and would be more about the town of Moralton, especially in the unproduced seasons 4 and 5. In fact, word has it that there were going to be entire episodes that barely even featured Orel, if at all. It would be a very dangerous idea to make episodes like those if they just jumped right into them without developing the rest of the town. Luckily, we have episodes like God's Image that put them fully on display, and I gotta say, for the most part, I really like these guys. I mean, it's obvious that they have some very negative character traits, but they're still interesting, even if they're not exactly role models, you know? Having a focus on the side characters also helps the humor as well. Because Orel's genuinely a good-natured kid, the only time we can really see him go far in his dark comedy is when he doesn't know that he's doing something wrong, or if he goes crazy like in the episode where he's not allowed to go to church. Though we're not quite there yet. This means that the show's able to show off just how good it is at dark humor. It knows that racism is bad, and it knows that we know that racism is bad. So it's not gonna try to teach us all about how you shouldn't judge people because of the color of their skin. Nah, it just decides to have some fun at just everybody's expense. The humor's also noticeably a lot faster paced than in season 1. Maybe this is because of the new style that they're going for. Maybe it's because they're more used to the show. I don't know, but whatever the reason, I'm all for it. And if you lovely people out there are thinking of watching this episode, well, first of all, yes, please do. It's very, very good. But don't just watch it for the comedy. Watch it for the story as well. Oh yes, God's Image has some story elements to it, and we're going to discuss them right here and right now. Firstly, I want to cover this super brief blink and you miss it moment with Shapey. Take a look.
Enjoyable whistling tunes and a no-prob attitude.
A lot of people look at this and say, this is proof that Shapey knows that Stopframe's his dad. And yeah, I definitely see it. Even a kid as dumb as Shapey has to know that he looks nothing like Clay, acts nothing like Clay, so is probably not Clay's kid. Well, that, and there was also this moment in Loyalty.
Mine!
It looks like everybody wants a piece of me lately.
Just a little thing I wanted to comment on, but now let's get to the real meat, the opening scene. Here, Clay and Orel are eating breakfast at quote-unquote China Food Town, and Clay tells Orel that he and Bloberta, out of the goodness of his, not her, own heart, they're gonna stay together, purely to show everyone that they care about their kids. Wink wink, nudge nudge. And I'm not just adding that wink wink, nudge nudge. Clay even says that the fact that he and Bloberta don't care about their kids is nobody's business but their own. And he says it right to Orel's face. And Orel doesn't care. All he wants is for his family to stick together whether they're happy or not. And this isn't because Orel's being selfish, I want to make that perfectly clear. He just doesn't want his family to split up. Also, he doesn't really know just how unhappy they are yet. Remember, for the most part, Orel wasn't really involved in their story in The Best Christmas Ever. He only found out that they were planning to get divorced at the end, and then prayed that they would get back together. And sure enough, it looks like it happened. He doesn't know about the infidelity, the fighting, the backstabbing, the bitterness. There's something else that we see here that we're gonna see a lot throughout the rest of the show, but it's Clay trying to make himself look like a great person in front of his son. Now, it goes without saying that Clay doesn't necessarily care about Orel. He just knows that this is his only biological child, so he wants Orel to look up to him and maybe, just maybe, even end up being like him when he grows up. There could be a lot of reasons for this. It could be because he sees a little bit of himself in Orel when he was that age, or maybe it's all an image thing, or I don't know. You guys can debate that in the comments all you want, and I'm really interested to hear what you have to say, as the outro usually says, but I just want to focus on how much Clay strokes his own ego in this scene. He's trying to make Bloberta look like the bad guy, which, to be fair, she is for cheating. Yeah, I know her situation was bad, but that's still not an excuse. He takes sole credit for the two of them getting back together and tells Orel not to thank God for it, just thank him. And the way that he tells Orel that he doesn't care about either him or Shapey really makes it seem like he does, unless you pay close attention to his words, which I think we all know that Orel wasn't. He was probably so happy that his parents were getting back together that he tuned the rest of what Clay said out. And last but certainly not least, this is also the beginning of the Florence and Dottie story. Once again, it's blink and you miss it, but it's there. In fact, it's right here.
Then how can a stuck-up pretty lady also be made in God's image?
Foreshadowing. Foreshadowing. Where would I place this in terms of overall ranking? So far, I'd say it's right under Best Christmas Ever. It's funny, it's dark, and it's starting to have some of that character stuff that we all know and love. So, once this video's done, if you haven't seen it already, or if you want to go give it a rewatch, I highly recommend you go check out the Moral Orel episode, God's Image. And let me tell you, it's a sign of things to come, because Season 2 is going to be a big improvement on the first, but we'll talk about that when we get there, okay? Well, beautiful friends, that marks the end of today's video. What'd you all think? Comment below and let us know because we're always excited to hear what you guys have to say. And yes, this is sort of a new outro. You know, Billy gets tired of editing the same thing over and over again, and to be honest, I'm kind of getting a little tired of saying the same thing over and over again. So, why not try something new, right? Variety is the spice of life. But enough about that, let's get on to the comment of the day. Are you guys ready? Because I most certainly am. Today's comment of the day goes to Rashid Mashani. I say check out some of Enter's newer stuff. First thing I'd recommend is his video on the AVGN movie. His content's improved a lot, and it's been great to see. You, him, Shady Dorgus, Josh Scorcher, Alpha J, and Pie Guy Rules are probably my favorite channels on the site in regards to critiques for animation and games and stuff. Also, the fact that this is the best episode of Adult Party Cartoon really puts the whole show into perspective. It's like a Lovecraft story where the main character realizes how small humanity is in the world compared to the looming threat of an angry squid dragon sleeping in the ocean, and yeah, there's a lot to unpack in this one. It's a little bit longer than what I normally read, but there's just a lot I wanted to comment on this. First off, I've heard mixed things about Enter's newer stuff, but hey, maybe I'll check him out again someday. I love Pie Guy Rules as well. Shame he retired. It's just that VTA curse, man. I wasn't the only one to get it. Even if it's not VTA specifically, it's just that SpongeBob series of his, man. And yeah, it really does put Adult Party Cartoon into perspective. The fact that this is the most bearable and it's still basically an animated nightmare, yeah. One of the worst shows of all time. I actually think that the internet clout is fully deserved. I'm not gonna mince words about it. It's a terrible, awful show, and to be honest, I would be happy to never see it again. But that's just me. And also a lot of other people. So, now it's time to thank our Patreon executive producers, Leaf Razor, Valkyria, Whoop-Doo, MD the Dude, Blackjack, Nightingale Wednesday Nightmare, Unkale, Manny Paredes, H.R. Hoffman, and Edward Haas. If you two would like your name read at the end of every Media Mementos video, then consider donating to our Patreon, which has a link in the description below. Okay, this part's not new. Okay, I'll find some new way to say it, because, it's kind of a catchphrase, but it's not the best one, so tune in next time for something new, I guess. And I do hope you tune in next time, because it'd be great to see us, so, yeah. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time. During my time in the Moral Oral fanbase, as well as covering individual episodes here on YouTube, I've come to realize that there are some episodes that, let's just say, aren't exactly held in high regard. We've covered two of these already, those being God's Chef and Waste.
I know that taste.
A lot of people don't exactly care for them because of their gross out nature, and that compared to the rest of the show, they're kind of basic, I guess you could say. But that begs the question, what are the others? And how bad could they possibly be? Well, let me tell you, those episodes are Love, Holy Visage, Elemental Oral, and Geniuses. Because we already covered those last two episodes, I'm just gonna go over things briefly right here. They're gross, but they're not the worst. God's Chef comes really close, though.
Why?
It's part of our lifestyle.
And now on to the other four episodes, except I don't really know if I can do this on my own. Covering 4 moral oral episodes that people don't seem to like is kind of a big task, especially for one video. Well, it's a good thing I just so happen to be collaborating with Ian from OK Fine Be That Way. Yeah, if you don't know this channel, they're the ones that did every episode of Moral Oral Ranked, and that Game Dude documentary that I totally haven't seen like 3-4 times already.
You're looking at me like I'm crazy.
Say hi, Ian!
Hello. My name's Ian from OK Fine Be That Way. No, really. My first name's Ian, my middle name's From, and my last name's OK Fine Be That Way. Anyhow, today I'm joining Trevor in this video to talk about the Moral Oral episodes Holy Visage and Elemental Oral. Even though I analyzed these 2 episodes already on my own channel, today I'm taking a much more in-depth look at them. Huge thanks to Trevor for letting me be a part of a Media Mementos video, and I hope all of you enjoy listening to my beautiful vocal cords. Back to you, Trevor.
Okay, now it's on to the episodes. I'll start off by talking about Love, the second episode of Season 2. This one gets a lot of hate. Yeah, it's on this list of hated oral episodes, but this one seems to get some of the nastiest reactions out of the entire series, and that's because of the overall plot. You see, Orel finds this dog when he and his family are having a family picnic. He adopts the dog, who he quickly names Bartholomew,
One of our Lord's lesser-known yet very important disciples.
and he quickly becomes his best friend. Not only that, but he becomes one of Moralton's most popular citizens. And of course, given the fact that Moralton is full of such lovely, humble people, they don't take kindly to the fact that this dog is getting a lot more attention than they are, causing them to all stage, I guess what you could call an intervention for Orel.
With all that love being spread everywhere, this dog is dangerous.
forcing him to put the dog down. And that's the episode. That's it. Alright. And before we go any further, I just have to clarify that this episode is actually not written by Charlie Kaufman. He only came up with the idea for Love, he didn't actually write it. The actual writer was series creator Dino Stamatopoulos. There you go, hope that ruins your fun. Have a nice day. I'll be real, this is not my favorite episode. In fact, I'd actually say it's in my bottom 3, only being beaten out by God's Chef and Geniuses, which we'll cover later. I don't hate this episode by any means, but it is a little uncomfortable to watch, and I do see where a lot of the people who say that this is the worst one come from. For example, it's really dark.
Does that mean Bartholomew is going to burn in hell?
Now let's be real, Moral Orel is not exactly a happy-go-lucky kind of show. Especially when it comes to the humor, this thing loves dark humor, especially in the first 2 seasons, but for a lot of people, it kind of goes too far with the ending and yeah, I guess I can understand. I've had dogs get put down before, and it does not feel good at all. But I will say that this episode is actually very important to the overall flow of the series. Remember what we talked about with the best Christmas ever? The whole point of that episode was to open our eyes to the truth of the Puppington family, where, contrary to what Orel thinks, they're not some kind of happy, supportive group. No, they're actually full of treachery, insecurity, and infidelity. Which is a very stark contrast to the way that Orel sees them now, and up until the episode Nature. This one does the same thing, but at a larger scale. Not only does it show the family in a much worse light, but it also shows that they're not the only ones that are like this. The entire town of Moralton is just as petty, cruel, and insecure. Meaning that yes, like what we said in the Orel character quest video, Orel is the one good person in this entire town. He's the only one who actually listens to what the Bible teaches and applies it to his life, rather than just using it as a way to be the worst person ever.
Come on, go for me, son.
Attaboy.
And I don't know, up until the ending, I found this one pretty funny. There seems to be this widespread misconception going around that cruelty automatically equals lack of humor. Now, I don't really know why people think this. Maybe it's because of people like Mr. Enter? I don't know. But some of the best comedies out there are really overtly cruel. Like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, the first 3 Vacation films, or hey, even early SpongeBob. A lot of things that people hold in high regard despite the fact that, yeah, it's primarily about suffering.
You like Krabby Patties, don't you, Squidward?
Now, does this episode go too far? That can be subjective. But as for me, I'd say it's fine, but it's not necessarily the best. And like I said in the God Chef video, if the worst that Moral Orel can get is just not that great, that speaks volumes to how good this show really is. And now for the next 2 episodes. They're both in Ian's hands, so I'll see you guys again when we talk about Geniuses. Take it away, Ian.
Thank you, Trevor, and hello, Media Mementos fans! The first episode I'm talking about today is Holy Visage. Out of all the episodes we are covering in this video, Holy Visage is probably my favorite. It's not one of the best episodes of the show, or even the season for that matter, but I do find a lot of stuff to appreciate here. In this episode, Orel gets a pointy Jesus bobblehead from a gift shop on a school trip. After an accident on the bus, the bobblehead gets impaled into a Jewish doctor named Dr. Chosenberg, resulting in the man being hospitalized. The residents of Moralton refuse to have Dr. Chosenberg treated due to believing the wound to be holy, and as a result, Dr. Chosenberg gets worse and worse. When it comes to why people aren't fond of Holy Visage, I personally believe it's for 2 reasons. 1, it's gross, and 2, it's mean. Let's talk about the gross out humor first. When it comes to Season 1, many people seem to dislike the episodes God, Chef, and Waste, largely due to the gross-out humor of both of those episodes. Holy Visage also contains a lot of gross-out moments, with the sick patients of the hospital coughing into Dr. Chosenberg's wound and giving him more diseases.
He's contracted hepatitis, rickets, gonorrhea, and a dozen other diseases in less than 2 days.
Incredible.
I'd actually argue that visually, this episode is even more graphic and hard to watch than God, Chef, or Waste. While it's not always my favorite type of comedy, I don't completely write off gross-out humor like a lot of other people do. Mr. Enter, especially nowadays when everything is so clean and sanitized, I have a much bigger appreciation for gross-out humor than I did back in the early 2000s, when every adult show was trying to be as gross as possible. Holy Visage, in my eyes, manages to make the episode feel gross without it coming across as too excessive or try-hard. It plays out kind of like an adult-oriented Looney Tunes cartoon to me, in that it explores all the different ways in which a simple situation like this can go wrong. Holy Visage also contains a lot of funny dialogue, social satire, and character moments that makes sure the episode has different types of humor to offer, rather than just making it a solely gross-out episode. Take notes, adult party cartoon. But onto the second and probably bigger reason that people aren't fond of this episode, that being that it's too mean-spirited. As I stated, this episode is about Dr. Chosenberg, who is a one-off character. I have to say, I really like this character a lot. He feels much more grounded in reality than a lot of the other characters, which makes for a really interesting dynamic between him and Orel.
Good night, Jesus!
It does make me wish that Dr. Chosenberg was in more episodes, because I think he would have been a great addition to the regular cast. A lot of people find this episode hard to enjoy because Dr. Chosenberg is really nice and doesn't deserve the situation that he's thrust into. I would say that this is accurate. He doesn't deserve it in the slightest. However, I think that doesn't detract from the episode because of Orel's character arc throughout. Orel knows that Dr. Chosenberg is suffering due to his injury, but he also knows that the residents of Moralton are relying on the wound to help their problems, at least in their mind. This creates a really good conflict for Orel, as the last thing he wants to do is disobey his elders, even when it's clearly the right thing to do. I really like the dynamic between Orel and Dr. Chosenberg for this reason, as well as the contrast between their personalities, which I talked about earlier. When thinking as to why this episode has somewhat of a negative reception, I think back to my all-time favorite Simpsons episode, Homer's Enemy. Much like Holy Visage, Homer's Enemy features a one-off character who is much more grounded and empathetic than the regular cast, entering a cartoony world and suffering as a result. There are some clear differences, like Homer's Enemy having a much darker ending than Holy Visage, but there is still somewhat of a comparison to be made. While I don't think Holy Visage is anywhere near as good of an episode of television as Homer's Enemy, I still find a lot to appreciate about it for similar reasons. I like seeing a more realistic character entering with such a cartoony cast, and yes, suffering because of it.
What? This was a contest for children!
Yeah, and Homer beat their brains out.
It's a great reminder that, while these characters may be fun and entertaining to watch, I wouldn't want to be in a 50-mile radius of them in reality. No, Dr. Chosenberg doesn't deserve what's happening to him, and that's kind of the point. It's really highlighting how the ignorance of these people can cause serious harm to others. If the writers gave Dr. Chosenberg a similar fate to Frank Grimes, I would have thought the episode had went too far in this circumstance, but thankfully that doesn't happen. I find the ending of Holy Visage to actually be quite relieving, which does make up for a lot of the discomfort I felt while watching the episode. So yeah, I actually quite like Holy Visage overall. It's also an episode that, much like Praying, shows Orel being open-minded to people with other religious beliefs, which I always think is noteworthy. I can understand why this episode would rub someone the wrong way, but for me, it hit a really good balance between comedy and misery that works well enough, even though, like I said, it's not among my favorite episodes in the series. When it comes to my least favorite episode of Moral Orel, that honor easily goes to Elemental Orel. I remember when the show was less popular, I would see a few people call this one out for being on the weaker side. Nowadays, I don't hear people call this one out as their least favorite very often, but it still resides at the bottom of my list. I can definitely understand why many people dislike the other contentious episodes of Moral Orel. God's Chef and Holy Visage feature a lot of mean-spirited gross-out humor, which can turn people off. Love Ends with a Dead Puppy moment, which can do the same thing. Geniuses is really weird, out there, and kind of off-tone with the rest of the series. Elemental Orel is none of those things. Well, except for maybe weird, but not more so than other episodes. I consider this to be the worst episode, not because the tone feels off or because it goes too far for me, but really more due to the fact that the writing just comes across as sloppy. The jokes don't land, the drama doesn't land, the plot is all over the place, and Orel feels out of character. It all comes across as extremely underwhelming, which is not a word I often use to describe Moral Orel. The plot of this episode features Orel playing detective and solving mysteries around the neighborhood. When someone steals the church's donation money, and by someone I mean Joe, Orel is on the case to catch the culprit. When I say Orel is out of character here, this is what I mean.
You're still a suspect in the case, you know.
I know Orel is playing a detective role, so he's acting a little bit different than he usually would act, which is totally fine. My problem lies in how Orel comes across as downright cruel to Marionetta, due to thinking that she stole the church money. He accuses her for really no good reason, and yeah, I get the joke is that Joe obviously stole the money instead of her, but whenever he adamantly accuses her of stealing the money, it comes across as a lot meaner than Orel's usual self.
I never thought of that.
It's only logic. Follow her! She'll lead us to the money!
Characters can act out of character if they have a good reason to do so. Obviously, it was out of character for Orel to beat up Mr. Figurelli in the episode Charity, but it made sense because he was suffering from crack withdrawal. Elemental Orel doesn't give Orel a proper motivation to act the way that he's acting. I think the intent here was to show that he was getting too into his role as a detective, but it ends up making Orel unnecessarily unlikable in this instance as a result. That also undermines the latter half of the episode when we're supposed to feel sympathy for Orel. On top of Orel's detective role feeling off in terms of his characterization, my other issue with it is that it doesn't go far enough in terms of being funny. The basic formula of a Moral Orel episode, especially in Season 1, but also in Season 2, is that Orel starts off with an innocuous intention to do good, which gets incredibly out of hand as the episode continues.
Orel! What are you doing?
Elemental Orel starts off the same way, but Orel's actions here don't really lead to anything that funny or crazy. Sure, Orel discovers that his parents have a hidden secret, but that's not because of something crazy or hilarious that he did to get to that point. He just kinda happens to stumble across the situation. It's very underwhelming. Speaking of which, I also take issue with how this story shifts halfway through the episode to be about Clay and Bloberta practicing bigamy.
That means swinging.
This is completely irrelevant to the initial story of Orel searching for the missing church money. Granted, we do see scenes with Bloberta that hint at this reveal before it happens, but those scenes feel weird too for having nothing to do with the plot that's happening at that moment. It feels like they Frankenstein 2 episode ideas together without spending enough time necessary to fully explore one or the other. It makes Elemental Orel come across as sloppily written, which is not a criticism I'd give to many other episodes of this show. I want to make it clear that I don't dislike this episode because it changes its tone. Moral Orel has plenty of episodes which feature drastic shifts in tone, which is part of what makes them so good. Nature Part 1 and The Best Christmas Ever are the easiest examples to point to, and those are obviously two highlights of the entire series. For the sake of this comparison though, I want to point to the episode that aired right before Elemental Orel, that episode being Satan. Satan featured some really funny moments, some really dark moments, and some surprisingly emotional moments. Even so, it worked really well in that case by following Coach Stopframe's emotional journey throughout the story. There was a through line that grounded the episode, which allowed it to feel consistent, even with the radical tone changes. Elemental Orel does not have that because it changes the focus of what the episode is about halfway through. Thus, when the tone of the episode changes, it feels inconsistent and jarring. Changing the focus of an episode's plot can work for a more absurdist comedy show like Aqua Teen Hunger Force or The Simpsons, but it doesn't really work for Moral Orel, at least not in this manner. I guess when Aqua Teens or The Simpsons do it, it feels more purposeful, like they're deliberately trying to throw the audience off. If Elemental Orel was attempting to do something similar, then it didn't come across that way to me. Despite everything I've just said, I don't really hate Elemental Orel. There are some funny moments here and there, like Bloberta spraying Shapey with the sit spray, and a few good moments with Reverend Putty. I think this is the introduction of his iconic hot rod with the sexy license plate. Elemental Orel is weak by the standards of a Moral Orel episode, but the standards of a Moral Orel episode are pretty high. There are no episodes of this show that I would classify as a total waste of time.
Amen.
Anyway, now that I've talked about my least favorite episode of Orel, it's time to hand the mic back over to Trevor to talk about geniuses.
I have not made it a secret in the slightest that, out of every episode of Moral Orel, Geniuses is my least favorite. However, a lot of people seem to misunderstand why it's my least favorite. For those of you who don't know, I myself am part of the Christian faith. And a lot of people seem to have misconstrued what I said in the God Chef video to mean that I hate it because it pokes fun at religion. Have you seen this show? Yeah! If that's what really bothered me, I would have stopped watching a long time ago. And I'm not one of those stuck-up kind of Christians that can't take the punch.
So Pokemon is a game that teaches children how to enter into the world of witchcraft.
So long as you can take it when your beliefs are being punched at right back, it's totally fine. In reality, there are two main flaws that Geniuses has that totally ruins it for me. The first one goes back to what I said in the God Chef video. Most of Moral Orel is able to poke fun at bad Christians who use their religion to justify their evil ways and don't really understand their own faith. And they do it in all different aspects like fearing God, prayer patterns, loving your neighbor, and different translations of the Bible.
Forgive your debtors! Forgive your trespassers!
In this episode, they try to talk about how the bad Christians as seen in Moral Orel can never really seem to engage in a proper debate without citing the Bible. Because, as a side note, if you're trying to debate religion and your only source is the Bible or whatever your religious text so happens to be, that's not going to sway your opponent if they don't abide by its teachings or believe what it says. Okay, that's an interesting topic, so what do they do with it?
Don't change the subject, Doctor. Even you can't ignore all the evidence that God made Adam out of
How do you account for your jutting brow ridge and your stooped ape-like stature?
Nothing.
Huh?
They just kind of make the statement, and that's it. Episode over. Yeah, they kind of try to say, oh yeah, they can't handle it, they just have to double down and hide all the facts that prove them wrong. But again, they're just stating it, that's it. Let's talk about the episode Repression, because I feel that out of all the episodes of Moral Orel that have something to say, this one does it the best. In this episode, Principal Fakey is having an affair with Nurse Bendy, you know, like he has been throughout the rest of the series, and he's coming to terms with the guilt of the whole thing, and is looking for a way to clear his conscience. Eventually, he comes across good old Repression, and eventually he decides that he's not at fault for what he does. He's an authority figure and a righteous, upstanding man. He could never do something as terrible as adultery.
I trust you!
What makes Repression work way better than Geniuses is the fact that it has layers. Like an onion. First of all, whenever Principal Fakey does things to Nurse Bendy, he's having the time of his life. That is until he blows his load. Then all of a sudden he feels really guilty and can't stand himself. But even though he's going through all these things in his head, he never expresses it outward. In fact, he's still trying his hardest to make sure that his wife doesn't find out, and neglecting her in the process. The rest of the episode shows his mental gymnastics that he goes through in order to avoid responsibility for what he does. And this isn't something that just applies to religious arguments either. Whenever someone is faced with the fact that they're doing something wrong, it's human nature that they'll find anything to either excuse what they've done or find someone else to take the blame. So it doesn't just work as a commentary on religion, but it works as a commentary on human nature as a whole. Geniuses tries to do the same thing. We as humans don't really like to admit when we're wrong, so we will try to bend logic as much as possible to make sure that we're right. Some of us have bigger boundaries than others, but still, this is something that, deep down on a psychological level, we all have. The problem is that they don't do anything with it. They find the ape man, they make him into a normal person, he loses a debate, then they lock him in a freezer until he wakes up in the future. That's it. There's no real discussion or nuance, layers, anything really that the other episodes that make a point try to do. This just drops the argument, and that's it. It's ironic that this is an episode about how bad Christians can't debate, when it itself can't really convey the argument it's trying to say. And then the second problem is that this episode is really one note. The jokes are, well, okay, actually not jokes, joke. The joke is really repetitive and it doesn't build at all. It's the same thing for 11 minutes, and yeah, I get it. There are some episodes of Moral Orel that have the same joke over and over. The difference is that those episodes build. Let's take a look at Waste, for example. This episode has one joke, and it's that people keep drinking Orel's pee. But it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Up until the end of the episode, it's at such an absurdly large level that you can't help but laugh. Unless you don't find it funny. Geniuses doesn't do that. It's 11 minutes of the same thing over and over, and then there's just some weird ending with Zorel at the end, and yeah, nah, this one doesn't do it for me. But at the same time, it's also not the worst thing I've ever seen. Not even close. I'd give this episode 4.5 out of 10. If this was from most other shows, I probably wouldn't think all too much about it and just think that it's nothing special. But the fact that it comes from a show like Moral Orel makes it that much worse. Orel has such a high standard for excellence, so whenever it takes a misstep, even when it's objectively not that bad, it seems bad by comparison because we're always going to be comparing it to things like Turn the Other Cheek, Nature, Grounded, Alone, Honor, and all the other episodes that make the show as beloved as it is. So, do I personally hate any of these episodes? No. But I will also admit that quite a few of them are some of the worst that the show does have to offer. And with all of these, I can understand how people wouldn't like them, but I can also understand why people would. Especially because comedy is a very subjective thing. I might not find Geniuses to be funny, but you just might. I may find Holy Visage to be funny, but you might not. That's okay. We don't have to agree. We're not the same person, so I don't expect us to have the same sense of humor. The point of this video is basically to tell you guys where we stand on these episodes and how we came to that conclusion. So yes, those are the 4 most hated Moral Oral episodes that I haven't already covered. Not horrendous, all things considered, but compared to everything else, these don't exactly cut it.
Thanks, Trevor, and thanks to all of you for watching this video. What's your least favorite episode of Moral Oral? Are you a big fan of Love, Holy Visage, Elemental Oral, or Geniuses? Do you think the reception they've received is too harsh? Comment below and let us know your thoughts. If you enjoyed hearing my opinions and listening to my silly Canadian accent, feel free to come over to my channel OK Fine Be That Way for more. I've made a lot of documentary and analysis content over there, including a video featuring Trevor himself about David Cross and John Benjamin's fallout with Adult Swim. Now it's time to thank the Media Mementos Patreon supporters, including Masters of Fate, Kev Messick, Manny Paredes, Ryan Williams, and Leafstorm. Also big thanks to the Patreon executive producers, including Aaron Vasquez, Albert Robinson, Blackjack, Edward Haas, H.R. Hoffman, I Am Fove, Unkale, Who Else But Zane, Whoop Doop, and YouTube Melkwad. If you'd like to have your name in the videos as well, donate to the Media Mementos Patreon. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Pain, 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 pain. Pain just got hit by a car. Pain just fell off a building. Ah!
Max Payne. Rated M for mature.
It's no secret that I love Moral Oral. Take a look at this playlist if you don't believe me. But one of the questions I've seen a lot is, can I skip Moral Oral Season 1? I can see why people are asking that. It's very different from the rest of the show. Not only that, but most fans seem to agree that it's the weakest season out of all 3. And yeah, I absolutely agree with that, but still, I think you should give it a shot. Especially if you're going through the show for the very first time. You need to see Season 1. Let me tell you why. So first off, just because it's not as good as what's to come, doesn't mean it's bad. In fact, I'd say it's pretty good. While it's not anything spectacular, I think it does what it aims to do pretty well. Especially the dark humor. That was the whole point of Moral Oral in Season 1. Being dark, twisted, and hopefully funny. There's episodes like Oral thinking that God's omnipresence means that God is literally inside of him, and then proceeds to get himself in some serious trouble. There's also God-fearing, where Oral's upset that he didn't get scared of the church's haunted house, and then decides that the only way for him to really be scared is to have God be angry at him, so he proceeds to break all 10 commandments. If you think that sounds funny, then yeah, give it a shot. It's just as funny as the premise suggests. However, it is worth noting that there are some bumps in the road. 2 to be specific: God's Chef and Waste. Now, I've already covered God's Chef, so I'm not really gonna get super in-depth into it. So all that I'll say about it is, yeah, it's definitely one of the worst episodes of the show, but it's also not that bad. But that's mostly my perspective. A lot of people really don't like it. And that's because it crosses a line. It's just too gross for a lot of people. Same with Waste. I will say that Waste is a little bit better because whereas God's Chef's pretty monotonous and is the same thing throughout the entire 11 minutes, Waste at least builds. It's not just the same level all throughout. It starts off small and then gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then by the end, it's just gigantic. Like God's Chef though, the joke wears out pretty thin. But like I said, it's not as thin as it is in God's Chef. And if you can stomach what's in these 2 episodes, you'll be just fine. The first season won't throw you off. In terms of writing, there is something you should know about Season 1, though. It's very formulaic. Most all the episodes have the same template, and I'll explain to you what it is. Oral is doing something, and an authority figure in his life, more often than not one of his parents, tells him that it's wrong. Oral goes out of his way to try to do what's right, however, he goes to such an extreme that he ends up causing more damage than before. Oral gets spanked by Clay, who gives him a really backwards moral, and then haha, it's funny. I will admit, that's a downside of the first season. They all kind of play out the same way with a couple exceptions. But still, what it does with the formula, I think really works. It's not like the early incarnations of Scooby-Doo where it's basically the same episode with just a different monster and window dressing. There really is different content. Different character paths, different jokes, different situations, different lessons. That's what keeps the show fresh. Although, I am happy that it strayed away from this formula in Season 2. If you want more information about that, well, hang tight. We're not quite there yet, you know? Another reason you should give Season 1 a shot is because of the shock of what's to come. It gets darker, more serious, and has a lot more focus on the other characters, not just Orel. And then Season 3? Wow, that is a completely different show. But a really good one. So, I don't think I've ever really gone in depth about this in a video before, but I didn't exactly go through Moral Orel in order. My first episode was Help. Yeah. But I did know a lot of the themes at the time, so I did understand what was going on, but I will say that it would have had a lot more of an impact if I saw Season 1 first. It's kinda like what made Doki Doki Literature Club so effective for a lot of people. It started off as one thing that was a lot more lighthearted and fun, and then turned into this. That's Moral Orel, although it's not nearly as sudden. Having the proper build-up will make all the difference. If you skip right to Season 2 and then go into Season 3, it'll still leave an impact for sure. I watched Alone before I watched more than 3 episodes in the first season, and it still left me messed up. But imagine what that would have done if I would have watched the whole thing. And I'm still kicking myself for not going in order. So take it from a guy who didn't watch it that way. If you go in order, you're gonna thank yourself because it's gonna be that much more exciting. And then there's also the aspect of it's gonna make a lot more sense when you get around to Season 3. Contrary to popular belief, Season 1 is not skippable. There's a lot of setup for what's to come, specifically in 3 episodes, which I'll be highlighting right now. The first one is a small one, but it still counts. Loyalty. Yeah, it sets up Joe, but that's not really what I'm talking about here. I'm more talking about Stopframe, particularly Clay and Bloberta's weird relationship with him. Bloberta obviously pines for him, but he doesn't feel the same way given the fact that he's attracted to Clay, and Clay is attracted to him, but of course he's stuck with Bloberta and can't do anything about his feelings. Now I will say there's some setup in other episodes like Waste, but this is the most important. Why? Because it's the most telling. It's a blink and you miss it scene, but it sets up the dynamic that's going to be present and a driving force throughout the entire show. The next one is Maturity, in my opinion the most underrated episode of all of Moral Orel. A lot of people say that Season 2 is where the serious and plot development, character-driven stuff started, but no, it started here. The Best Christmas Ever doesn't count, by the way. Yes, I know Adult Swim aired it first, but it's supposed to be the last one in the season, so it doesn't count. Okay? Good. Glad we're on the same page. In this episode, Orel wants to become as mature as he can, and he starts watching a lot of the adults in Moralton for advice. In doing so, he stumbles across his parents having a very heated conversation. Here we finally see the first cracks in Clay and Bloberta's marriage start to show. Contrary to everything we've seen up until this point, they're not the typical happy-go-lucky, supportive 1950s mom and dad from the nuclear family. No, their marriage is terrible and unhappy. Without watching this scene, a lot of the stuff that would come up later in episodes like Numb would seem kinda random. They were happy before this, so what changed? Was it really the writers bending the world so that they can tell more interesting stories? No, not at all. It was here from the beginning, case in point, this scene. But that's not all. Skipping forward a little bit, Orel gets a hold of some of Clay's alcohol and starts drinking, and then ends up becoming just like Clay. He's angry, he's distant, he's aggressive, everything that Orel isn't supposed to be. This is important for a number of reasons. First off, Clay's main goal throughout the entire show is to mold Orel into a little version of himself. To many, it would seem impossible because of Orel's general character. He's the exact opposite of what Clay's supposed to be, like I said a few seconds ago. However, as it turns out, Orel is actually very close to becoming like Clay. All he has to do is give in to what his dad's been saying and he'll end up on the same path. Broken, unhappy, and feeling like he's forever alone. As we see Clay try to instruct Orel throughout the rest of the episodes, we know that this could be very dangerous. Orel isn't going to shrug them off and go back to being all happy. He could end up slipping, and if he does, it could be too late. Skipping forward a bit, it's also important because of the episode Nesting, the penultimate episode in the series. Since the events of Nature, Orel has become distant with his dad. He doesn't care about Clay's lessons or spankings. He's his own guy now, and he's got his own walk of life that's different from Clay's. And that's one of Clay's worst fears. We've seen Orel at his lowest. We've seen the, I guess you could call it, bad ending for Orel. And we know now that he's not gonna get there. He's gonna be okay. Seeing this moment will help Nesting have that much more impact. And then the last episode I want to highlight, and I'm sure you all saw this coming, the best Christmas ever. By the way, this was the absolute worst choice to pick for the first episode to air. Making this episode go first has the show tip its hand way too early. It's like playing poker with your cards backwards, you're just not gonna win. This is basically a season 3 episode that aired 2 years earlier. It's dark, it's sad, it's full of character growth, and surprisingly, despite being a first season episode, everybody's personalities have already been decided. Clay is grumpy, possessive, and insecure. Bloberta just wants to find happiness but gets really defensive about what she's done, which was admittedly terrible. I think we can all agree on that. Orel's blissfully ignorant of everything bad going on until it's too late, and Shapey's a demon. This is where the seriousness for Moral Orel starts. This is where we start having to look at the characters with a lot more of a critical eye. We have set up before this, like in Maturity, but this is all on display. This is where the Moral Orel that everybody's been raving about starts, and you can't skip it. You just can't. Especially because the next episode ties into it, but still, even on its own, this is important. It's funny that Adult Swim decided to cancel the show because it got too dark when that was always the creator's intention. As you've seen throughout this video, there's been so much setup that there's no way it wasn't going to become the show that it was. Adult Swim getting upset about that is real dumb on their part, just saying. And if you want to hear my thoughts on every episode of Moral Orel Season 1, well, here you go. Yeah, that's right, we're actually gonna do it. I'm reviewing every episode of Moral Orel anyways, and because most of these are kind of the same, we may as well cover them here, right? The Lord's Greatest Gift, perfect way to start off the show. It's funny, it's dark, it's Moral Orel. God's Chef gets old really quickly and does nothing to help itself out. Charity, God's Chef done right. Waste, God's Chef done slightly better. The Blessed Union, uncomfortable but still dark and funny. Omnipresence, it has a weird sounding premise, but they managed to make it work. Not stellar or anything, you kinda get the joke early on, but like Waste, it builds and builds. God-fearing, even better than Omnipresence. Loyalty, set up aside, it's really funny. And it's also one of the meanest episodes of the show, but not in a bad way. I personally think the comedy here is really effective. Maturity. Again, the most underrated episode of Moral Orel, not the best, but I think it's a standout episode that doesn't get a lot of attention, which is really unfortunate, so let's change that, shall we? And then the best Christmas ever. I'm not going to cover it super in-depth here because I'm actually going to give it its own review for the next episode review video, so all I'm going to say is, don't miss it. And if you're wondering where I'm going to rank all these episodes, well, here you go, look on screen. We've already covered Alone and Geniuses, so they're already here on the screen, but here's my order from favorite to least favorite that we've covered so far. So yes, it may be formulaic, it may not be super deep, but it's definitely funny and has a lot of important things for the future, so you should not miss Moral Orel Season 1. Well, folks, thanks for watching the video. What'd you guys think? What's your favorite episode of Moral Orel Season 1? And are you ready for us to cover the rest of the show? Comment below and let me know, because I'm always excited to hear what you guys have to say. By the way, this is our 11,000 subscriber special, so once again, thank you so much. We've been blowing up like crazy, and I just can't believe it. Both I and Billy, who for the record is the other guy who runs this channel, are amazed with how fast we're growing, and we are so thankful for each and every one of you, even those of you who are just subscribed to dislike or leave stupid comments. We still love you. Anyways, it's time to thank our Patreon executive producers, Leaf Razor, Azarius, Whoop-Doo, Michaela Bellamy, MD the Dude, and Blackjack. If you too would like your name read at the end of every Media Mementos video, then consider donating to our Patreon, which has a link in the description below. And now, it's time for the comment of the day. Today's comment of the day goes to Radville, and it's too long for me to read all right now, but you can go ahead and read it here on the screen, or you can go to the Dijonais video and check it out for yourself. They've got some really good insight here, and honestly, I agree with just about all of it. Now, we here at Media Mementos, both me and Billy, we're a little bit nicer to La Cienega, and we're hoping to get into that a little bit more some other day. But yeah, Penny needs some real friends, and fast. Not even Zoe's gonna cut it. She's just kind of a sheep, you know? Alright everybody, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time! Back when I first talked about Moral Orel Season 1, I mentioned that, while not the best season of the show, it's very important as it not only introduces you to the world of Moral Orel, but it also would present some of the most pressing themes that would be seen in Seasons 2 and 3. Now, this style was all fine and good for one season, but if it carried over into Season 2, that might be a little bit of a problem. First, the most obvious part, if we had just as much setup in Season 2 as we had Season 1, it would turn the viewers off because it's clear they're just kicking the can down the road and throwing out all these complex themes that they might never get to. And if they ever do, it'll be way later after you've already forgotten about it. Which I think is what happened to Adventure Time. I don't really know, I stopped watching really quickly, but yeah, that's at least what Pie Guy Rules said. And second, Season 1 was very formulaic. And with one exception, when it would talk about the deeper elements to the story or characters, it would only be in the background. If the show was gonna follow up with Dino's expectations, something had to change. And that's exactly what happened with Moral Orel Season 2. So let me tell you how Season 2 broke the formula and ended up making Moral Orel come into its own. Before we go over the structure of Season 2, let's recap what Season 1 was all about. It was all about comedy. While characters and serious themes were present, they were generally considered secondary features. They weren't nearly as important as making the audience laugh. And when it came to the jokes, for the most part they were pretty funny. Though most every episode followed the same exact storyline. Orel is doing something, an authority figure comes in and scolds him, telling him that whatever he's doing doesn't represent God's wishes. Orel misinterprets it, does something terrible, gets spanked by Clay, and then gets told a backwards message. That's all fine and good when the show's starting out, but by its second season, I'm sure that the viewers would expect something more. And that's what the show brought.
This week's sermon's gonna make your head spin.
Instead of following the same formula each and every episode, it made a wide variety of episodes that overall can be put into 3 categories, and I'm gonna go over them one by one. First, comedy for comedy's sake. These would be episodes like Turn the Other Cheek, Pleasure, or Courtship. Just like the last season, they're more focused on comedy than anything else. If they can make you laugh, they're doing the job right. However, they go about it in different ways. Gone are the days where Orel follows the same structure day in and day out, and for the most part, gone are also the days where he would do whatever it is he did in Waste in God's Chef. The closest one that comes to following the same formula, at least in my opinion, is Turn the Other Cheek, but this time it goes way further. The jokes are more out there, the scenarios are stranger, and they throw you for a loop quite a few times. Like how when Orel goes too far, he takes it out on his mom and dad. Similarly, in Pleasure, it goes way further than it ever did in Season 1. And it doesn't have the same ending that the other episodes in that season did either. Yes, it ends with Clay scolding Orel for what he's done, but it's handled way differently. For one, he doesn't spank Orel because Orel's gonna find that, interesting, let's just say. And in this episode especially, it's not Orel misunderstanding what someone said. It's someone straight up giving him bad advice. Naturally, since none of the adults in Moralton can accept responsibility for their actions, and also the fact that Orel has built a reputation by this point, he's the perfect person to blame for all the town's woes. It's clear that by this point, the crew has really found their footing and they know where they want the show to go, especially when it comes to the humor. I'm not saying that the humor in Season 1 was weak, far from it, but this is a lot more refined and sure of itself, and I think it really pays off. Type number 2, story. We haven't gotten to the full standalone review of Nature yet, but just mentioning that this is the Season 2 finale kind of speaks for itself. This is where the story stuff is no longer in the background, and things like The Best Christmas Ever are starting to become the norm. All the growth and situations that these people have been through over the course of the show are starting to pay off. We can grow to love Orel, we can hate Clay, we can be really confused at whatever Shapey and Block are doing. You get what I mean, right? Since they've taken the time to add the drama in the background all the way up until this point, and that they were able to do it in a tactful and also subtle way, this has much more payoff than if they just sprang it up out of nowhere.
Get away from me!
as great as The Best Christmas Ever was, that served a different purpose to nature. The Best Christmas Ever was shocking because of where it first took place, at the end of Season 1, which, up until this point, for the most part, had been a pretty lighthearted and happy, albeit dark, comedy. And then suddenly all of this is starting to come our way? Nature, on the other hand, isn't as much of a shock for the audience as it is for Orel. It's starting here where he realizes that the perfect world that he saw Moralton as doesn't really exist, especially when it comes to his dad. And it's from this point on that the show would change forever. But I'll talk more about that when we get to Season 3. And it's not just nature that's story-focused either. We also have Be Fruitful and Multiply, the first episode that prominently features Reverend Putty in a somewhat serious-ish leading role. As we discussed a couple days ago, this is where he first comes across his daughter, Stephanie, and Stephanie is, not exactly the typical Moralton view of what a person should be. Despite this, she's still the answer to his prayers. Reverend Putty is the loneliest man in Moralton, and he's been praying night after night for a woman to be his companion, and one shows up. Not a romantic companion, but one that's a natural family bond. This is a lesson that a lot of Christians try to tell each other, and also non-believers. Sometimes God does approve your requests, just not always in the way that you think he will. And this starts a little bit of growth in Reverend Putty's life. He's no longer all on his own. He's got a daughter that, little by little, he can reconnect with and have something that he's always wanted. Well, yes, it's good to see Reverend Putty get some development. This also serves a purpose for what would come later on, especially in the unproduced 4th and 5th seasons. For those who don't know, the show was going to start to drift away from the Puppington house and be about Moralton at large, even though it would still be called Orel, and not Moralton or... Anyways, we needed episodes like these. Had the shift happened right at Season 4 and we had no development with the other cast members, this would have been a very jarring and unwelcome change. But because the groundwork was being laid out this early, we were starting to care about some of the supporting cast, so when it came their time to take over, we wouldn't bat an eye. In fact, we might actually like it better than if it just followed Orel. Orel is a great character and all, but his journey would not be enough to fill 5 seasons worth of episodes. That's why we needed some time with Reverend Putty, or Stephanie, or Florence, or all these other characters. And presenting them in the way that they did, being story episodes with a little bit of humor here and there, helped endear us to them that much more, showing that even if the main character is different this time around, it's still the same show that you know and love. And now the third and final type of episode, this one's gonna be kinda quick, comedy with a purpose. To summarize, it's the last 2 episode types put together. They're the same comedy episodes that we mentioned early on, but they have some story and or setup elements that pay off later down the line, such as the Lord's Prayer. Here we get the introduction of Christina, we have Shapey get swapped with Block, and we see just how rigid the Moralton mindset really is.
There's a wrong way to believe in God?
Sure. You know the 21st commandment.
Even being Christian isn't enough to save you from their wrath. You have to be their specific type of Christian. Reading another translation of the Bible or being in a different denomination is automatically evil. Orel doesn't understand that, but Clay and Bloberta do, and they're trying to pass that down to their son. But just like Christina, Orel doesn't care, and as long as someone follows God, that's all that matters. We have offensiveness where we see Miss Censordoll being at her full evil for the first time, getting her primed and ready to be one of the main antagonists of the show, although tragically most of the episodes featuring that would not be produced. We have Love, which we've talked about a little bit before, which has Bartholomew, Orel's new dog, gaining all the love of everybody in town, and he may or may not be the second coming of Christ. Also, quick side note, we didn't forget to mention that in the video. We just didn't because it wasn't important to why people hate the episode. Okay? Good? Alright. And it shows us once again that the people of Moralton, despite preaching about love, kindness, and acceptance, can't stand that the dog is starting to, quote-unquote, usurp their popularity, and decide to put it down just for their own ego. Then there's Repression, which has the same purpose as Be Fruitful and Multiply, but it handles the story in a much more comedic way. When you get down to it, Moral Oral Season 2 is essentially the bridge from Seasons 1 to 3. It's got a little bit of what made the other 2 seasons special and puts them together, thereby making the show as a whole a bit more of a cohesive experience. Unlike Season 1, I don't hear anybody say, "Oh, can I skip Moral Oral Season 2? There's no way. I mean, come on, really? But if you did, not only would you be missing a lot of the important story beats, but you would also get tonal whiplash from going from Season 1 to Season 3. And no, before you ask, having the best Christmas ever being the last episode you see before you get to Season 3 is not enough to justify the change. From that perspective, it would feel like the show was doing a 180, and while the new episodes might be enjoyable, they would definitely make you confused and wonder how the show got to this point to begin with. So that's what makes Moral Oral Season 2 extra special. It took everything that Season 1 did right and improved on it, but it also tried new things and set the show up for what it was about to be in a year's time. In other words, Moral Oral Season 2 is the one that broke the formula. Well folks, thanks for watching the video. What'd you guys think? What's your favorite episode and or aspect of Moral Oral Season 2? Comment below and let me know because I'm always excited to hear what you guys have to say. And now it's time to thank our wonderful Patreon friends, starting with our Masters of Fate, Manny Paredes, Kev, Leaf Storm, Ryan Williams, Chan 11, Woody Woo, MD the Dude, and Diego V. And now our executive producers, Unkale, Blackjack, Edward Haas, HR Hoffman, Who Else But Zane, YouTube Milkwad, Albert Robinson, I Am Fove, Aaron Vasquez, Ravioli Supremo, and Indiscreet One. If you too would like your name read at the end of every Media Mementos video, then why not consider donating to the Patreon? There's a fancy little link in the description below for you to check out. And if you want to get more involved in the Media Mementos fan community, we've got a Discord server. There's also a link to that in the description as well. Alright folks, thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you guys next time.
First blood, double kill, triple kill, humiliation, team killer, killing spree, holy shit.
Thank you to Albert Robinson for this Patreon raffle review. If you too would like your idea for a Media Mementos video to come to life, then stay tuned until the end of the video and I'll tell you how. Moral Oral. It's sure been a long time since we've talked about this. I don't think I've made a full-on Moral Oral based video since Versus the Network 2023. Huh. Okay. So what better way to return to discussing one of my favorite shows of all time than by finally making a video that I've spent over a year planning out. Many people online talk about Moral Oral and why it's great, what makes the characters tick, even the history behind it, but nobody's really talked about what I believe is the best part of the series, that being the theological aspect. And I think this is because the creators of the show, as well as most of the people who discuss it, are not members of the Christian faith. I myself am a member, so I feel like I'm the one to give you Moral Oral, a theological perspective. So, many of you who didn't know that I was Christian already are probably surprised that this is one of my favorite shows. Isn't this a series based around making fun of Christianity? Well, kind of? Not exactly. It's complicated. So, Moral Oral isn't exactly about making fun of Christianity, so to speak. It's about making fun of the bad Christians that make the rest of us look bad. You know those Westboro Baptist Church types who go around and spreading the word of God in a way so hateful and negative that it scares people away from God's message? Yeah, those people. And while yes, at first, Moral Oral tries to play up these quote-unquote stereotypes in an over-the-top cartoonish way, as time goes on, especially during the third season, the characters start to become more down-to-earth and realistic, perfectly encapsulating types of real Christians that damage the faith. We have characters like Clay, Bloberta, or Principal Fakey, who pretend to be these pious and righteous individuals, But to them, their sins are far more important than their walks with God. We have Miss Censordoll, who uses her quote-unquote faith, as I've discussed previously in this video here, to rise through the ranks of the town and basically become its undisputed dictator. And then there's Reverend Putty, who, while yes, is one of the kindest members of the town, he's still not doing this whole Christian thing right, despite being the town's reverend. The list goes on. Everyone has a different walk of life in Moralton, but everybody seems to be a die-hard Christian who can't tolerate any other point of view. But in actuality, that's not the case. I don't really think very many of these people are Christians whatsoever. Oh sure, they decorate the town in Jesus-themed everything and have Super God as one of their most popular superheroes, but none of that really means anything. All this is lip service. God doesn't care about stuff like this if your heart doesn't match. And in the case of the Moralton residents, it doesn't. With the exception of the pure characters like Orel, when do you see any of these people pray outside of when they need something from God? They never take the time to speak with their Lord and Savior that they supposedly love, because, to them, Christianity is just a lifestyle. It's no different from being, say, a vegan, or a Democrat or Republican. It's something you just choose to be and you walk around with that label. Technically speaking, yes, the Christian faith does involve some lifestyle changes, considering that there are certain things we have to do and other things we have to forego, but it's not something casual that you can do whenever you feel like it or whenever it's convenient. If you're a real Christian, it's a part of who you are, and that will reflect itself in your actions. And judging by what the people of Moralton get up to on a regular basis, I don't think those actions are manifested through faith. Now, in the case of being a hot and cold Christian, I was all set to call out Coach Stopframe for being the biggest example. After all, as seen in the episode Satan, he's only a Christian when it suits his needs. If he can find someone to give him whatever he wants in another religion, then so be it, he'll go there. If he thinks that he's got all his bases covered and that at the end of the world he'll be clear no matter what, that's not how that works. His faith is conditional, and he's going to find out the hard way that won't get him very far. Like I said, I was all set to rip into Stopframe, but then I realized that's pretty much everybody else, at least in terms of the adults. While they're not as open about their passiveness towards God, they only seem to care about him either when they're at church or when they're in the public eye. Other than that, they don't care. They're just going to live their lives the way they see fit. What a lot of non-believers don't understand about Christianity is that it's not just trying not to sin and worshiping God, it's a legitimate relationship with our Creator. It's a mixture between friendship and a parent-child sort of thing. As it says in John 15:15, I no longer call you my servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends. For everything I have learned from my Father, I have made known to you. And if you're having a hard time understanding what I'm trying to say here, allow me to put it in, I guess, a more earthly way. Let's say that you've got this friend, and while at first they seem pretty cool, over the years of knowing them, you notice that they only seem to hit you up whenever they want something from you, like money or a ride, and all of your conversations in times other than those all seem to be one-sided, either being ignored or left on read. At the end of the day, are you really going to consider this person a friend after they've clearly shunned you for all this time? Even if you love them and really enjoy their company, this level of rejection's got to hurt. That's the same way God feels with Christians like these, ones that are willing to put their own sin against the God they claim to love. Because that's another thing going on in Moralton. They know what they're doing is wrong, but they don't try to stop it. While we as Christians try not to sin, we also have to accept the fact that the only perfect being is God. Everybody else is going to fall short. Romans 3:23, anyone? So when we sin, we don't just go, oh well, and keep going at it, but at the same time, we don't wallow in our misery and put on a pity party so that we can impress God with how sorry we are. All we've got to do is confess our sins to God and try not to do it again. If we slip up in earnest, He'll understand. He's got an endless amount of forgiveness to give out. But if we keep going back to our sin willingly, again and again, then that's a different story. That's actively choosing to defy God and not caring what he says or what he wants us to do. As Christians, we need to believe that what God's calling us to do, sure, may not seem as fun in the eyes of the world, but at the end of the day, it's gonna make us a lot happier and in some cases, much safer. This is especially apparent in the cases of Clay and Bloberta. Bloberta's consistently sexually frustrated and tries to look for pleasure outside of her marriage, and Clay, well, he's a basket case with too many problems to list in this video, but never once do they try to make anything work or try to find some other solution for their frustrations. No, they just bottle it inside, don't share it with anybody, not even God, and cause these pent-up frustrations to amount into worse actions, and then the cycle repeats. Even Reverend Putty is guilty of this, even though he supposedly understands the Bible better than anyone else in town, and, has dedicated his life to serving God. He will only follow the commandments that he wants to follow, such as don't lie, don't steal, etc. But then when it comes to things like no fornication, or do not commit adultery, who cares? Reverend Putty, much like everybody else, is going to do exactly what they want, and hey, it's okay. They're already forgiven of their sins, right? In a way, they're putting their sins above God. Sure, they may think he's nifty or whatever, but given the choice between him and the worldly temptations that they're facing on a day-to-day basis, the temptations are going to win out. Again, going back to that bad friend analogy, say you're hanging out with that friend and they're finally giving you the time of day, and then they're doing something that really bothers you, like, say, smoking. You tell them, I don't like the smell, or I have asthma, etc. Please don't do that around me. And what do? They light another one up, and another, and another, and another, and then the whole pack is gone. And this happens every time you see them. They give a half-hearted apology, if anything at all, and then they just go back to doing it, as if nothing ever happened. When fighting a sin that you're deeply entrenched into, it's understandable that you're going to have some bumps in the road to recovery. Like I said before, God doesn't expect perfection, he expects effort. You have to at least try. If you're wondering where all of this stems from, I have two leading theories, both of which are very applicable in Christian society. The first is that most of the people in Moralton are what we at the church call casual Christians. In other words, they're Christians who can say that they're Christian, maybe even do a couple Christianly things, but on the whole, they don't know anything about their faith, they barely have the actions to back it up, especially when times get tough, and at the end of the day, it's not something that's high on their priority list. This state of being a casual Christian is one of the most dangerous things you can be in the Christian faith. God doesn't want us to stay put. He wants us to grow and develop in our walk with him. That's because, and this is true for just about everything ever, if you're not working to get better or striving to improve, you're going backwards. And that's how things like the Lost Commandments pop up. Sure, they may be in the silly moral oral style, but there are so many people who go around believing heresy blindly because they never take the time to read God's word. They accept whatever they hear at face value because, oh yeah, that sounds plausible, sure, let's go with that. Distance from God causes a lack of knowledge of God, and in turn, makes you more vulnerable to being led astray. The most dangerous part of being this sort of casual Christian is that you think this is normal, and in turn, will develop a culture based around it where being a casual Christian believing these incorrect things is perfectly normal, and in fact, the right thing to do. There are a lot of false prophets out there, even today, so you've got to be careful on who you listen to. Take your time to read the Word of God and understand what it's trying to say. That's what the Apostle Paul used to do back in the day. Tell people, hey, don't take my word for it. Read Scripture and understand for yourselves. And in fact, I'm going to do the same thing to my audience here. Don't take what I say at face value either. If you're so inclined, read the Bible yourself and see if what I say checks out. Another problem with not being close to God is that a lot of times modern society will take what the Bible says out of context and use the out-of-context scripture for their own narrative, whether by accident or on purpose. For example, let's take a look at the famous or infamous Matthew 7:1. Judge not, that you be not judged. Sounds like a pretty good verse, right? Don't judge other people or you'll be judged in return. Well, let's see how it sounds in context instead. Judge not, that you will be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use it will be measured to you. In other words, if you judge people a certain way, that same standard is going to come back onto you. It's not saying not to judge, it's just saying be careful if you do. Because God doesn't work for a rules for thee, not for me sort of thing when it comes to his children. There are many more cases like this in the Bible that I could go over, but this is one of the main reasons why spending time in prayer and in the Word is important. It helps you understand what God's trying to say and what he expects us to do. But no, that's too cumbersome for Moralton. They're already saved. They don't have to put in the effort. Again, whether it's a friend relationship or a father-child relationship, there always has to be effort put in, otherwise things are going to fall apart. And that leads me to my next theory as to why this keeps happening: status. This is a society where being a Christian is all there is. It's the only option. You're either a Christian or you don't belong here.
Get out of here, filthy sinner!
Remember what I was saying earlier about the lip service? Moralton does this so that they can seem more righteous in the eyes of others, not in the eyes of God. You can't fool God. He knows your heart. If you're really putting in the effort and you're struggling, he'll understand. If you just don't care and are pretending to be a Christian or doing the bare minimum to be classified as a Christian, he'll know. You can fool other people, but you can't fool God. And in some cases, that's all the people want. Clay is an unhappy man in general. No matter what happens to him in life, he'll never be happy. The best he can do is try to make the best out of a bad situation. The way he goes about doing it is pretending to be a godly man that everybody can look up to. He'll be an authority figure, someone that everybody admires. You see, it's all about him and what he can get out of this. He was raised in a household that was very fundamentalist and close to the Christian faith, but over time, partially because of his spoiled child upbringing, Clay has grown distant from God and mostly sees him, as well as everybody else in his life, as a means to an end. Clay is his own God. His image is the most important thing. God just so happens to be a part of that image, but if the culture of Moralton started to change and God became old news, so to speak, he would kick God to the curb.
God, I hate you, Jesus!
You can see this a lot with casual Christians in the Bible Belt, where, obviously, given the name of the region, it's largely culturally accepted that you'd be a Christian. And as a result, they go through the motions and don't really follow up on their faith. Now, I'm not saying that's everybody in the Bible Belt, of course. I'm just saying in the terms of the casual Christians. But then there's people like Censordoll who use their supposed faith in order to gain power. They are so focused on worldly elements that they are willing to forego whatever belief they have in God in order to get what they want. As I've mentioned before, I've already discussed Censordoll's Christian shortcomings in this video here, but one of the things I want to highlight here that I didn't there is that people like Censordoll are far more common than just the Westboro Baptist Church and other related churches, quote-unquote. I don't consider those real churches, but that's a story for another day. There are people like Jesse Duplantis who want $54 million to live in the lap of luxury because, in his own words,
he wouldn't be riding a donkey.
Neglecting the fact that, of course, during Palm Sunday, Jesus rode in on a donkey, perhaps the lowest form of transportation in those days aside from walking. He's clearly just using his faith in order to get money. Or how's about Ernest Angley, who used his religious influence to not only have volunteer labor at his church-owned restaurant, but also used his influence to, do terrible, non-YouTube-friendly things to his churchgoers. To quote ancient-era Mr. Enter, "What I'm doing is wrong, I know that it's wrong, but I'm going to do it anyways."
He made that airplane so cheap for me, I couldn't help but buy it.
That's why we're on that airplane. We can talk to God.
Unfortunately, because religion is such an important part of many people's lives, there are many bad actors who will try and take advantage of this in order to make a profit. Now, I'm not saying that people like Duplantis or Angley weren't Christians. I don't know their hearts, so I can't really say. But what I will say is the pursuit of money or sexual gratification is not going to make them happy in the long run. They can't take any of that with them when they go to heaven. Then when they finally get there and God's asking them about their life, what are they going to have to say? Oh yeah, God, I totally defiled and defrauded hundreds of people. Wasn't I a good representation of you on earth? Granted, these are televangelists largely. They are pastors, yes, but they're on a larger scale. Well, this goes all the way down to the bottom. Right down to your small-town local church with only 12 people in attendance. This can happen there too. Like I said, religion is important to a lot of people, so therefore their religious leaders are considered life leaders in general. That's always something you've got to look out for. A church that's run by a pastor who's worshiping themselves and their own lives just as much, or perhaps even more, than they are God. This isn't just dangerous for the Christians, though. This is dangerous for the non-believers and the children.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
One of our main purposes here, being on this earth, is to be a representation of Christ to others. That way we can help them find God as well, and save them from you-know-where, helping them have a fulfilling life here on earth as well as a life in heaven. Not to say that if you become a Christian, all of your problems go away. In fact, it's probably going to be even harder considering how much the world doesn't exactly care for us sometimes. But hey, like I said before, this world is temporary. Everything that gets brought up to heaven, that's forever. And while yes, we as Christians are called to help others come to Christ, there are many Christians out there who make it so hard for everybody else. That's because, much like the people of Moralton, their actions make Christians look evil.
Greg Locke burned Catholic rosaries and Harry Potter books on Halloween night. And yes, he was also at the Capitol riot.
You ain't seen the insurrection yet.
Let's start with that infamous "you're going to hell" way of teaching the Word of God.
You are going to hell!
Yeah, that's not really the way to go about it. First of all, it's making us look like a bunch of lunatics, that is self-explanatory.
My wife is going to hell! My kids is going to hell!
But additionally, that's also a bad way of starting a foundation with God. Going back to that friend analogy one more time, what would you rather have? A friend who's being your friend because they legitimately care about you, or one who's afraid of getting shot so they just pal around with you so they don't die? Or how's about the way that Moralton residents react to sinners?
You're not sinning, are you?
Yeah, one of the unfortunate, most common stereotypes with Christians is that we don't exactly take kindly to sinner folk. But what many of these Christians don't understand is that yelling and screaming at people is not going to change people's lives. All that's going to do is get them angrier and have them double down. Or they'll just straight up ignore you and brush you off as insane. Yes, sin is bad. It goes without saying. But the sinners themselves don't have to be bad. In fact, more often than not, they're good people. Good people, I might add, that Christians should be looking to save. Nobody is ever good enough to be a Christian, so to speak. Everybody sins, everybody messes up, everybody has flaws they'll need to work on from the cradle to the grave. So being viscerally angry and overly aggressive, or actually aggressive at all, is not the way to go about it. Take, for example, any time when Moralton residents are around someone that they deem as spiritually inferior. Since they're the Christians who are supposedly so close with God, they're automatically above this person, and they're just a little peasant who needs to try and get up to their level. Yeah, that's a good way to scare somebody who's trying to learn about God. But another thing that these people don't really understand is that this was not the kind of company that Jesus kept. He didn't surround himself with a bunch of yes men who were pious, holier-than-thou individuals who annoyed everybody around them. No, in Jesus' own words, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Mary Magdalene, one of Jesus' best friends, was a prostitute. Matthew, one of his most loyal disciples, was a tax collector, perhaps the most corrupt job back in that day. And then there's the other people that he would be kind to throughout his time on earth, such as another tax collector Zacchaeus, or the woman at the well. All supposedly bad people in Moralton's eyes who've done bad things, but God showed them love and helped them get better. Now, if you think I'm gonna say Jesus never screamed at people and never berated them for doing things wrong, well, actually, he did. But it was never to the sinners. At least, not exactly. People like Zacchaeus or the woman at the well, they became Jesus' friends. The people that Jesus screamed at were the Pharisees.
The whole world is following him.
These were the embodiment of Moralton. On the surface, they were the most pious individuals around, but God knew their hearts.
He is watching!
Whenever they would dump buckets of money into the treasury, they would surround themselves with onlookers or people playing trumpets so that all eyes would be on them. It wasn't about what they were giving to God, it was about being as cool as they could be. They would do anything to elevate their own status, all while breaking the very commandments they supposedly upheld. It was this group of false teachers that Jesus had the problem with, and the only ones that he tried to attack. If you held up a spiritual mirror to anybody in Moralton, they would be horrified to find that they weren't like those other people that Jesus saved. They were the Pharisees. But then in most cases they would just shrug it off because they don't care. But this isn't only dangerous to the non-believers and people who are curious about Christianity, it's also dangerous to the children. They grow up in a household with these bad, wrong, backwards beliefs. This is going to do either one of two things. One, which seems to be the most common in the town of Moralton, raising the next generation to be just as, if not more, misguided than the last, causing them to get further from God and spreading the wrong message throughout the community. From what I can gather in Moral Orel, each passing generation only strays further from God, all while being less tolerant of the world around them. As we can see with Bloberta's upbringing, the townspeople were certainly bad, but they weren't nearly as evil as what their kids would later become. And then the second, and increasingly most common one that's happening in this day and age, is that the kids will grow up to leave the church forever, always believing that this warped and twisted version of Christianity is the one that everybody else follows. Why would they ever want to be a part of that again? Now, I've experienced this firsthand. I have a series on this YouTube channel called Moralton High, where I talk about my time in this Christian high school that was basically the school version of the town of Moralton. My high school was almost exactly like if you took Moralton, the town from Moral Orel, and the town from Footloose, and mashed them together. Here, so many bad Christians were misrepresenting the word of God so intensely that a good half of my friends strayed away from the faith and have never returned, and have changed from atheists to downright anti-theists because they believed that what Moralton High was teaching them is what Christianity teaches in general. Things like being judgmental towards sinners, always being abrasive when challenged, seeing yourself as morally superior because you have the Spirit of God inside of you, things like that. A bunch of people who pretend to be, pious, religious, all that sort of stuff, but it's all for show. So not only are these people damaging their own lives and their own relationships with God, but they're ruining it for everybody else as well. Passing the wrong messages down, scaring people away from the faith. We can see this in Orel's development quite clearly. He's taught to hate anybody who reads a different translation of the Bible or has a different biblical tradition. Not knowing, of course, that if he were to read his Bible as he should, as it says in 1 Corinthians 1:10, I appeal to you, dear brothers and sisters, by the authority of our Lord Jesus Christ, to live in harmony with each other. Let there be no divisions in the church, rather be of one mind, united in thought and purpose. In other words, you can believe and practice different things, just please don't attack the denominations that you're not a member of. They're still worshiping the same God, because that's true. Since we're saved by faith and faith alone, different practices aren't going to make a difference. So if you do communion or not, or if you have traditional or contemporary worship, oh well, we're still going to the same place because we're still saved by the grace of God. Or how's about Orel learning that authority figures can't be wrong? That's why repression is the name of the game. Yeah, if we never atone for our sins and we never try to get better, we're only going to get worse. And now look at the state that Moralton's in, and I think you can see where that all came from.
Everybody back in! Come on, show's not over, folks! Back in, back in, back in!
Thankfully, in the case of Moral Orel, we can see that everything turns out okay. Orel, at the very least, becomes a functioning adult who's still a member of the faith, presumably having shredded all of the bad teachings that Moralton has taught him over the years. I always liked to believe that Orel grew up to be a reverend, so maybe he was able to set the town straight. But as for real life, it's not that simple. I really wish I could say that there was an easy solution to all of this, but no. Moralton is, technically speaking, a real place, and it's all over the world. Hopefully these types of Christians can find their way back to God and be able to accurately represent Christ. But until then, to the Christians and non-Christians alike, all I can say is arm yourselves with knowledge. And please, don't let Christians like these get you down. The Pharisees of old didn't win back in the day, and the Pharisees of now won't win either.
We're about to
On the
fly this-
airplane.
On the airplane's the
Come
only way I
on.
can grab it, see.
So that, my friends, is the theological perspective of Moral Orel. Well, folks, thanks for watching the video. What'd you guys think? What sort of new things did you learn, and what parts did you find interesting? Comment below and let me know, because I'm always excited to hear what you guys have to say. And now it's time to thank our wonderful Patreon people, starting with our Masters of Fate. Alan Nielsen, Brian Desero, Chan 11, Drew the Stew, Kev Messick, Platinum Bass, Sakamoto, Quiet Chap, Ravioli Supremo, Ryan Williams, Timey, Toko Blahuvian, and Woody Woo. And now for our executive producers, Albert Robinson, Blackjack, H.R. Hoffman, Indiscreet One, John Lopez, Kurt Bruenning, Leaf Storm, Unkale, Vanilla the Rabbit 98, and who else but Zane. If you two would like your name read at the end of every Media Mementos video, or to suggest a topic for a future Media Mementos video, since, you know, for the time being, I only make Patreon-suggested videos, then why not consider donating to the Patreon? There's a link in the description below for you to check out. Also, there's a link to the Media Mementos Twitter and Discord servers, so stop on by and say hello. Alright, folks, thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you guys next time.
We're all going to church!
Yay! What's church?
8 years later.
Yay! Church!
Slow down, Orel.
Plenty of God for everyone, son.
1 year later.
So, what am I grounded from?
Church.
Dad!
Later. Eventually.